long before marble temples rose beneath Mediterranean suns, before legions marched in cadence across distant frontiers, and before Latin echoed through the streets of a mighty capital, there was only a hill, a river, and a dream. In a corner of central Italy, cradled between gentle slopes and shaded by olive trees, the Tiber flowed in silence. Its waters carried no imperial ambition, only the soft reflections of sky and cloud. Along its banks, the soil was dark and generous, fed by rains and the quiet churn of time. Herds moved across the land slowly, and shepherds walked with staffs in hand, watching stars instead of borders. This was a time when Rome did not yet exist, not in stone, not in name, but perhaps already in the stories told beneath the moonlight. The myth begins with twins, Romulus and Remus, children of a forgotten line, abandoned to the currents of the Tiber, are said to have been carried not by fate, but by nature itself. A she-wolf, wild and watchful, discovered them where they lay, swaddled in reeds. Her body, warm and breathing, offered them life. She nursed them beneath a fig tree near the cave of Lupercal. Whether this tale is truth or poetry, it doesn't much matter. For in myths, cities are not born from fact, but from feeling. The Romans would carry this story like a lantern through centuries of shadow and triumph. It reminded them that their beginning was primal, intimate, and touched by both wildness and survival. A wolf mother and 2 infants. That is where the empire began. Over time, the hills around the Tiber began to whisper with activity. The Palatine Hill, where Romulus was said to have founded his city, became a place of early settlement. Not yet a city, but a cluster of huts, wooden, thatched, circular, standing like quiet thoughts in a landscape of potential. Archaeological evidence suggests that as early as the 8th century BCE, small groups of Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans mingled here. They traded, they married, they built with earth. What began as scattered villages slowly wove together, bound not by conquest, but by cooperation and proximity. Fire pits warmed their homes, and the smells of barley and goat's milk drifted through the air. Clay vessels held grain and olive oil. Children ran barefoot through the dust, chasing each other around the pillars of a life not yet called Roman. What made this place grow? Perhaps it was the location, halfway down the Italian peninsula, a natural crossroads for shepherds, traders, and travelers between sea and mountain. Perhaps it was the Tiber itself, a river narrow enough to cross, yet deep enough to move goods. Or perhaps it was something harder to name, a spirit of settlement, a subtle pull toward permanence. What we know is that, over time, this humble cluster of hilltop huts began to think of itself as a whole. A name was given, boundaries were felt, and rituals emerged, the quiet ceremonies that give structure to time and meaning to belonging. Even in its infancy, Rome was already reaching backward and forward, honoring ancestors while dreaming of legacies. As the centuries turned, these early Romans buried their dead in graves shaped with care, each one a whisper of memory. They made offerings, small statues, cups, beads, to gods whose names would evolve but whose essence would endure. Vesta, the goddess of hearth and flame, likely watched over the earliest homes, her spirit flickering in every fire that warmed a family. The past and present wove tightly here. For Rome, from its first breath, was not merely a settlement, it was a rhythm of light and dark, of birth and death, of myth and matter. And so, Rome's story begins not with a sword, but with a lullaby, not with conquest, but with caretaking. A wolf nurses twins in a quiet grove. Farmers plant grain by the river, and on the Palatine, the first fire flickers into the night. The empire lies centuries away. But the city, softly, is being born. As the smoke curled upward from hearths scattered across Rome's 7 hills, the shape of a community began to form. Not suddenly, but gradually, like clay softening under warm hands. In the centuries following its mythical founding, Rome was not yet the commanding republic remembered in marble, nor the militarized empire etched into textbooks. It was something quieter, a slow coalescing of customs, neighborhoods, and voices into a shared rhythm of living. From hill to hill, paths became well-worn. Neighbors greeted one another with nods, and somewhere in the space between necessity and tradition, a city began to emerge. Around the 7th century BCE, Rome's modest settlements were influenced increasingly by the Etruscans, a neighboring civilization to the north whose architecture, religious rites, and sense of civic organization quietly shaped Rome's foundations. The Etruscans brought more than trade and pottery. They offered patterns of urban planning and ritual that gave structure to space. Drains were dug, forums were outlined, and the idea of the city as something more than scattered homes began to take hold. It was here, in the in-between, between village and city, between influence and independence, that Rome slowly gathered its identity. During this time, the concept of kingship emerged. According to tradition, a line of 7 kings ruled early Rome, beginning with Romulus and ending with Tarquin the Proud. Yet even these kings were not all of one kind. Some were Latin, some Sabine, and a few, like the Tarquins, were unmistakably Etruscan in their customs. Their rule was not yet imperial or absolute. It was more priestly than political, a form of leadership that blended ritual with responsibility. The king presided over religious ceremonies, ensured the gods were honored, and slowly began to codify the customs that would later become the bones of Roman law. These kings were not distant figures carved in stone, but likely walked the streets with their people, clothed not in purple, but in familiarity. As the 6th century BCE unfolded, Rome's communal spaces began to breathe with new purpose. The Forum, at first just a marshy basin between hills, was drained and leveled to create a gathering place, not only for markets and trials, but for the murmur of daily life. It was here that people debated, bought bread, watched sacrifices, and observed the seasons change. Nearby, temples rose, modest at first, but deliberate. These were not simply places of worship, they were landmarks of shared identity. Each column and altar was a silent agreement between the citizens and the divine, a reminder that even in its earliest days, Rome did not separate the sacred from the civic. But beneath this gentle growth, tensions stirred. The line between ruler and ruled began to fray. Tarquin the Proud, the last of Rome's kings, became a symbol not only of tyranny, but of unwanted control. His rule, according to legend, was harsh and unyielding. His fall, when it came, was not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a new experiment. In 509 BCE, the monarchy was abolished, and a new system was whispered into being, a republic. It did not arrive like thunder. It crept in through quiet negotiations, alliances, and oaths sworn under the sky. 2 consuls would now hold power, sharing authority and limiting each other by design. The people, or at least some of them, would have a voice, not absolute, but emerging. The Republic's earliest years were more about restraint than revolution. The idea was not to rule grandly, but to prevent anyone from ruling alone. Power was divided, laws began to crystallize, and the Senate, an assembly of elders, offered continuity. These structures were not perfect, but they were stabilizing. They gave shape to the young Republic's days and allowed it to grow without losing its balance. Rome was still a modest city with wooden homes and narrow streets, but it now carried within it the heartbeat of something lasting, a belief in shared governance, however fragile. Yet, even within this new order, old inequalities lingered. The patricians, Rome's aristocratic families, held most of the influence, while the plebeians or commoners bore the burdens. This quiet imbalance would soon become a central theme in Rome's story, unfolding not through civil war, but through a series of slow, deliberate reforms. Over the coming decades, plebeians would push for their rights, not through violence, but through withdrawal, leaving the city, refusing to serve, forcing recognition. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written laws, would eventually emerge from this tension, etched in bronze and placed in the Forum for all to see. They did not solve inequality, but they made law visible, and in doing so, they planted the seeds of justice. So Rome, in these early centuries, moved not through conquest, but through conversation. It was a city building itself from within, hut by hut, custom by custom, compromise by compromise. Its people were not yet emperors or conquerors. They were farmers, craftsmen, shepherds, and priests. They debated in the shade of the Forum, honored the gods with quiet offerings, and slowly learned how to live together. This was the Republic's true beginning. Not a battle, but a balance. And from this balance, the world would change. In the heart of the young Roman Republic, where the morning light spilled over temple roofs and into narrow streets, the city exhaled into its new civic rhythm. But beneath this peaceful surface, something old remained unsettled. The Republic, though no longer ruled by kings, was still shaped by hierarchy. The patricians, descendants of Rome's oldest and most powerful families, held the highest offices, conducted sacred rites, and interpreted the laws. They spoke with the Senate's voice and carried the weight of tradition. But all around them lived the plebeians, tradesmen, farmers, artisans, and laborers, whose hands tilled the fields and whose coins filled the market stalls. They formed the body of the city, yet were kept from its spine. The early republic offered no easy access to justice for the commoner. Law was spoken, not written, and those who interpreted it, the patrician priests and magistrates, often kept its meaning guarded like a sacred text. To the plebeians, law could feel like a shifting shadow. Rights were unclear. Grievances, when voiced, might dissolve in the wind. Land ownership remained unequal, and debts weighed heavily on the shoulders of families with little recourse. The peace of Rome depended on these tensions remaining quiet. But quiet does not mean still. In 494 BCE, that silence broke, not with an uprising, but with a departure. It was called the First Secession of the Plebs. Facing mounting debts and unfair treatment, the plebeians chose not to revolt, but to withdraw. They walked away from the city, leaving the Forum, the fields, and the army itself behind. They gathered on a nearby hill, later called the Mons Sasa, the sacred mount, and simply waited. Without violence, without chaos, they removed their presence from the lifeblood of Rome. It was a gesture of remarkable clarity. If the Republic would not recognize them, they would cease to sustain it. The effect was immediate. Without its plebeians, the city could not function. Fields went unplowed, armies could not muster, markets stood half empty, and so the patricians listened. Negotiators were sent, and eventually an agreement was reached. The plebeians would return, but not unchanged. From this peaceful standoff emerged the tribune of the plebs, a new office created to defend the rights of the commoners. Tribunes were sacrosanct, protected by law from harm, and held the power to veto decisions they deemed harmful to the plebeian class. It was a quiet revolution, not one of swords, but of structure. A new voice had entered Roman governance, calm but steady. In the years that followed, this pattern would repeat. Tension would build, the plebeians would withdraw or appeal, and the Republic would shift to meet them. Reform came not from war, but from persistence. Each moment of withdrawal, each careful protest, added a new stone to the path toward equality. In 449 BCE, a second secession led to one of the Republic's most enduring legacies, the 12 Tables. These were not sweeping philosophical codes, but practical, visible laws. A farmer's fence, a debt's duration, a father's rights. Etched in bronze and displayed in the Forum, the laws made justice something that could be seen. For the first time, all citizens, rich or poor, could point to the same text. This movement toward balance was slow and far from perfect. The patricians resisted, often fiercely. Offices remained closed to plebeians for decades. But the plebeians did not fade. They continued to push for access, not through rebellion, but through negotiation and legal pressure. Over time, plebeians gained the right to marry patricians, to hold certain magistracies, and eventually to sit in the highest offices of Rome. In 367 BCE, the Licinian Sextian laws allowed one of the two consuls, the Republic's joint heads of state, to be a plebeian. A century later, that shift became commonplace. What had begun as exclusion became slowly inclusion. And yet, even as they gained rights, the plebeians held onto a communal identity, one built on patience, solidarity, and the memory of protest. They did not erase class lines, but they softened their edges. The plebeian story was not a single event, but a mood that lingered through Roman history. The belief that the law must be visible, that power should be questioned, and that even the lowliest voice might carry the future. Through these quiet reforms, the Republic matured. It did not shed its divisions entirely, but it became more flexible, more responsive, more enduring. The plebeians, who had once stood silent in the forum's shadow, now stood within its heart. And as the city continued to grow, absorbing new lands and challenges, the lessons of this era remained: that peace could be forged through presence, and justice through patience. As Rome slowly moved from a city of scattered settlements into a more unified republic, life in its streets and homes began to take on the steady beat of routine. The grand gestures of politics played out in the Forum and on the Capitoline Hill, but it was in the narrow alleyways, shaded courtyards, and sunlit fields that most Romans lived their lives. Their days unfolded not in sweeping reforms, but in small, habitual acts. Lighting a lamp at dawn, offering thanks to the household gods, kneading dough into warm bread. These were not the stories carved in stone, but they were the foundation of Roman civilization. A Roman morning often began before the sun had fully risen. In the homes of farmers on the outskirts or artisans near the heart of the city, the first stirrings of life could be heard in the scraping of iron tools, the low hum of water being fetched, and the soft rustle of sandals on packed earth. Families lived in close quarters, sometimes 2 or 3 generations under one roof, their lives centered around the atrium, the open interior space where the household came together. A shallow pool, or impluvium, collected rainwater in the middle of the room, reflecting the flicker of the morning light and the faces of those who passed by. Around it stood the lararium, a small shrine to the lares, the guardian spirits of the home. Here, quiet offerings were made: a bit of wine, a pinch of grain, a whispered hope for protection. Food was simple, shaped by the seasons and the rhythms of the market. A Roman breakfast, ientaculum, might consist of bread, olives, and perhaps some cheese or dried fruit. For many, the midday meal, prandium, was modest as well. It was the evening meal, cena, that held a special place in daily life. While the wealthy hosted elaborate dinners with multiple courses and reclining guests, most Romans shared simple fare: boiled legumes, porridge, lentils, fish, or fresh vegetables seasoned with vinegar or herbs. Wine was common, though often watered down. Plates were of clay or wood, and meals were often eaten with fingers or a small knife. But beyond the food itself, the act of dining was a moment of gathering, of stories exchanged, and the day gently unwound. The streets outside buzzed with life, but not in the noisy modern sense. Vendors called out softly, pushing carts of dates and nuts. Cobbled paths echoed with the quiet clatter of hooves and wheels. Children played with hoops, dice, or small dolls carved from bone or terracotta. Education, though valued, varied by class and means. Some boys learned reading and arithmetic from private tutors or in small schools, while others picked up skills from their family trades. Girls, more often, were taught domestic tasks at home: weaving, cooking, and the rituals of managing a household, though some did receive instruction in letters and music, particularly in wealthier families. Religion was not a separate sphere, but interwoven with daily moments. Small gestures, like tossing a grain into the hearth fire or pausing before a roadside shrine, were acts of spiritual grounding. The Romans did not view their gods as distant. Instead, the divine was present in every corner of life. From Jupiter's lofty authority to the humble spirit of a family's well or field, the gods were felt as quiet companions rather than lofty overseers. Days were punctuated by festivals and observances, not only grand processions, but also seasonal rituals that shaped the year like soft footsteps on a winding path. Work varied widely. In the countryside, laborers tended vines, pressed olives, and harvested grain, often according to a calendar etched in weather and memory. In the city, bakers rose before dawn, blacksmiths filled the air with rhythmic clangs, and woolworkers carded and spun fibers in courtyards dappled with sun. Markets bustled, not in chaos, but in comfortable repetition. Goods from across the region made their way into Roman hands: salt from the coast, timber from the hills, honey from nearby farms. Rome was not yet an empire, but it was already a node of quiet exchange. Each object passed from hand to hand, carrying a piece of another place. Evenings in Rome were peaceful affairs. As the day cooled, oil lamps flickered to life, streets emptied. In homes, parents told stories to their children of heroes, gods, and ancestors who shaped the world with quiet wisdom. These tales were not merely entertainment, they were a form of continuity. They told each generation where they came from and what was expected of them. Honor, duty, simplicity. These were the values passed down not through law, but through lullaby. And so the days flowed on, each one not unlike the last, yet all slightly different, shaped by the weather, the market, or a child's laughter in the street. This was how Rome grew strong, not only through governance or armies, but through lives gently lived. In the small rituals of home, the careful tending of family shrines, and the warm glow of shared meals, a deeper kind of resilience took root. These were the rhythms that would carry the Republic forward, even as its ambitions began to stretch far beyond the hills that first sheltered it. Before empire, before legions carved borders into stone, Rome began weaving a different kind of map, one not drawn in lines and battles, but traced softly through rivers, roads, and ancient paths of exchange. Trade was the Republic's quiet lifeblood, and long before its banners reached across continents, Rome was already bound to the world by the movement of goods. It was in the grain that arrived by boat, in the woven fabric carried by mule from distant hills, and in the olive oil sealed into amphorae and carried across the sea like bottled sunlight. The city's location was no accident. Cradled on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome enjoyed access to inland Italy and the western Mediterranean. The river itself, though not vast, was deep enough for small vessels to carry cargo from the sea to the city's heart. Just a few miles downstream lay the port of Ostia, a growing hub of maritime trade where ships bobbed gently in harbour, their sails furled like folded wings. Goods from across the known world passed through Ostia: salt from the coast, tin from Gaul, wine from Campania, and pottery from as far as Greece. The scent of foreign spices sometimes drifted into the city long before the merchants arrived. By the 4th century BCE, as Rome expanded its territory throughout the Italian peninsula, its commercial web grew thicker and more organized. The famed Roman roads, at first simple tracks trodden by carts and cattle, began to be paved with care. The Via Appia, one of the earliest and most enduring, stretched like a straight ribbon toward the south, linking Rome to Capua and eventually to the far port of Brundisium. These roads were marvels, not because of grandeur, but because of precision. Mile by mile, stone by stone, they connected outposts, colonies, and markets, making the movement of armies possible, yes, but also of bread, oil, letters, and memory. Within the city itself, commerce was a constant, low hum. The Forum Boarium, Rome's cattle market, stood near the Tiber's bend, echoing with the sounds of barter and animal calls. Nearby, the Macellum, or Central Market, offered meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables displayed beneath simple awnings. Roman coins clinked quietly in the hands of buyers, each one stamped with symbols of civic pride or past leaders, passing from palm to palm as silent ambassadors of value and trust. Prices weren't fixed, but fluctuated with the seasons, the weather, and the distant tremors of foreign harvests. Yet through all this, the market remained a place of gentle repetition, a predictable ritual in the lives of many. Trade extended beyond Italy. Even in the Republic's earlier centuries, Roman merchants found ways to reach the islands of the Mediterranean and the distant shores of North Africa and the Greek world. They sailed in modest ships, hugging coastlines, guided by stars and seabirds. Phoenician dyes, Egyptian papyrus, and Athenian ceramics found their way to Roman homes, not in abundance, but as treasured fragments of a larger world. These goods were more than luxuries. They were signals that Rome, even before its military expansion, was already part of something greater, a mosaic of cultures and economies, connected not by conquest, but by curiosity and need. Trade was also deeply local. Farmers brought fresh produce from the countryside, figs, lentils, chickpeas, leeks, and sold them in woven baskets beside the city gates. Bakers, having risen early to fire their communal ovens, sold loaves still warm, wrapped in linen or carried in reed trays. Potters offered jugs and bowls, each shaped by hand and bearing the marks of individual craft. These were not anonymous transactions, but familiar exchanges. Buyers and sellers often knew each other by name. A nod, a quiet word, a shared history, all part of the quiet choreography of Roman commerce. In rural areas, villae rusticae, countryside estates, became both homes and economic centers. Here, olive trees stretched in orderly rows and grapevines curled in the sun. Slaves and laborers worked the land, harvesting crops that would be pressed, stored, and sent toward the city. Roman wine, aged in clay jars sealed with resin, became both a daily staple and an item for distant export. Oil from southern Italy was shipped northward, poured into amphorae with pointed bases so they could stand in the soft earth of storage rooms. These estates were not isolated farms. They were the nodes of a growing economic organism, pulsing with seasonal rhythms and long-distance exchange. And yet, trade was not always smooth. Storms could delay shipments, wars could close roads, and shortages could unsettle even the calmest market. But Rome's system endured because it was layered, local when needed, expansive when possible. It did not depend on a single harvest or a single road. It relied on thousands of quiet interactions, each one a thread in the broader fabric of stability. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, as the Republic turned its eyes toward the Western Mediterranean and new rivals abroad, it was already deeply experienced in the art of economic balance. Rome's expansion would bring new resources, yes, but its strength had always rested not in sudden wealth, but in gradual accumulation, in the careful storage of grain, in the weighed pouch of coin, in the inked scroll recording debts and credits. This was the quiet miracle of Roman commerce, that it built an empire's skeleton before the empire itself took shape. Roads and rivers carried more than goods. They carried habits, expectations, and invisible agreements. They made distant hills feel near. They made strangers into neighbors. And they taught Rome that stability, like wealth, is often created not in battle, but in exchange. There was no single moment when Rome decided to become more than a city. No sudden proclamation, no flash of ambition carved in stone. Instead, the Republic's expansion emerged gradually, like water seeking the lowest point, drawn outward not by empire, but by necessity, by opportunity, and by the quiet momentum of survival. Surrounded by neighboring tribes, rival cities, and contested lands, early Rome learned that its borders were not fixed, they breathed, and with each breath, the city stepped just a little farther into the unknown. In the early 4th century BCE, the Roman Republic was still confined largely to the region of Latium, a patchwork of allied Latin towns, scattered hills, and small sanctuaries hidden among groves and fields. But pressure from beyond stirred the need for defense, and defense soon gave way to conquest. One of the Republic's first great tests came not from afar, but from within Italy, from the nearby Etruscans, Samnites, Volsci, and Aequi. These were not foreign empires, but fellow Italians, organized in tribes and city-states, each with their own histories and ambitions. Skirmishes were frequent, alliances ever-shifting, and diplomacy often resembled a delicate dance between conflict and coexistence. Rome's early military ventures were not grand campaigns, but seasonal affairs. Citizen soldiers, farmers during most of the year, would be called to serve, marching out in organized ranks with short swords, oval shields, and quiet determination. The Roman army was evolving in these years, shaped by both Etruscan models and internal experimentation. The phalanx, a tight Greek-inspired formation, slowly gave way to a more flexible structure, the Manipular Legion, allowing Roman forces to adapt to rugged terrain and varied enemies. Each legion moved like a living organism, divided into smaller units that could support, flank, and shift with the needs of battle. These were practical changes, not born from theory, but from the soil of experience. But expansion was never just about the sword. After battles, Rome rarely destroyed what it defeated. Instead, it absorbed. Cities were offered alliance, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. Colonies were planted. Small Roman settlements in key locations that acted as both watchposts and cultural seeds. These were not sprawling imperial centers, but modest communities of citizens and veterans, built with Roman roads, Roman temples, and Roman law. Over time, the landscape of Italy began to change. Latin became more common. Roman customs took root, and loyalty to the Republic spread, not just through conquest, but through the promise of connection. One of the most significant early conflicts came with the Samnites, a powerful hill people of central Italy. The Samnite Wars, fought intermittently over several decades, beginning in the mid-4th century BCE, tested Rome's endurance. These wars were marked not by sweeping campaigns, but by prolonged struggle, ambushes in mountain passes, uneasy truces, and the slow erosion of resistance. Rome suffered defeats, including the famous humiliation at the Caudine Forks, where Roman soldiers were forced to pass under a symbolic yoke in submission. But from these losses, Rome learned. It did not retreat into pride. It adapted, reorganized, and continued forward, like a river that bends around stone. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had secured dominance over much of central and southern Italy. This did not mean every town was Roman, but that they were bound by treaties, alliances, and oaths. Some were given partial citizenship, a unique Roman invention that offered protection and limited rights while preserving a sense of local identity. This flexible, layered approach to control allowed Rome to grow without constant revolt. The Republic became a mosaic of peoples tied not only by law, but by roads, military service, and shared rituals. Every spring, as citizen soldiers gathered for campaign, they came not only from Rome, but from dozens of allied towns, each one bound to the Republic in mutual need. Meanwhile, back in the city, the Senate debated, consuls planned, and triumphs, ceremonial marches for victorious generals, began to appear in the calendar. These were not yet grand spectacles, but quiet acknowledgements of service, duty, and the careful extension of Rome's reach. The temples on the Capitoline grew more numerous, maps became more detailed, and though no one could yet see the shape of the future empire, the foundation was quietly forming underfoot. The expansion brought wealth too, but slowly and not always evenly. War spoils trickled in, enriching some families more than others. Land was confiscated and redistributed, leading to early murmurs of inequality. Yet for the moment, these changes seemed distant. Most Romans still lived as they had before, tending fields, honoring the gods, serving when called. The Republic's early growth was not yet a rupture. It was a widening, a careful extension of Rome's boundaries outward, like the spreading of roots before a tree breaks the surface. Through all of this, Rome remained deeply Roman. Its ceremonies continued. Its farmers returned home after campaigns, hung up their armor, and resumed the rhythms of planting and harvest. The Senate still governed, with voices old and cautious. And the Republic held itself together, not through charisma or divine rule, but through the steady machinery of shared obligation. Expansion was not yet empire. It was still, in many ways, defense, of allies, of trade routes, of memory. But it would not stop here. Beyond the mountains, new challenges waited. Across the sea, a powerful rival watched. And in the years to come, Rome's slow march would carry it far beyond the hills of Latium, into wars that would shape the entire Mediterranean world. Across the sunlit waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea, past rocky coves and windswept islands, the masts of foreign ships rose and fell with the tides. Their sails were dyed deep purple, their hulls dark with age and salt. These vessels belonged to Carthage, a city older than Rome, perched on the coast of North Africa like a watching eye, its harbors full of noise and gold, its temples shaded by palms. If Rome was a city of hills and oaths, Carthage was a city of wind and trade, of merchant dynasties and silent wealth. It had risen not from shepherds, but from sailors. And as Rome extended across Italy, Carthage waited across the sea, not in fear, but in caution. Two worlds were slowly drifting toward one another, each unaware of the long shadow the other would cast. Carthage had once been a Phoenician colony, founded centuries earlier by seafaring peoples from the Levant. From its beginnings, it was shaped by the rhythms of the ocean. While Rome measured time in harvests and campaigns, Carthage moved with the movement of ships, the arrival of spices, the shifting prices of tin and silver. Its influence spread not through conquest of land, but through control of ports. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage dominated the Western Mediterranean. Sardinia, Corsica, parts of Spain, and key sections of Sicily fell within its quiet grasp. Its navy was unmatched, its wealth immense. But it had one vulnerability: it was not alone. Rome and Carthage had crossed paths before, mostly as trading partners or uneasy observers. Treaties had been signed, boundaries respected. But as Rome crept south and established a firmer presence in southern Italy, it came closer to Sicily, a rich island that acted like a bridge between the two spheres. And in Sicily, conflict was always close at hand. A skirmish between local rulers in the city of Messana, small, seemingly unremarkable, would become the spark. In 264 BCE, Rome intervened and Carthage answered. The First Punic War had begun. It was not a war of grand battles, but of attrition. For more than 2 decades, the two republics grappled over Sicily, trading blows at sea and on land. Rome, inexperienced at naval warfare, built fleets in haste. It trained its sailors not on the water, but on dry land. Benches lined up in rows, men rowing in the dust, imagining waves. Carthage, by contrast, moved like the wind, its ships swift and silent. But Rome, as ever, was persistent. It studied, adapted, and built. Again and again, its fleets were destroyed and rebuilt. Slowly, the tide began to turn. By 241 BCE, Rome had secured a victory. Carthage ceded Sicily. The sea, once Carthaginian, now heard the sound of Roman oars. But the peace was uneasy. Rome, emboldened, took Sardinia and Corsica soon after. Carthage, stung but unbroken, turned its eyes westward, to Iberia, the land of silver and mountains. There, a young general rose from a family of pride and vengeance. His name was Hannibal Barca, and his memory would stretch like smoke across Roman dreams for generations to come. Raised in the shadow of defeat, Hannibal was sworn to hatred of Rome as a child, and in time, he would lead one of the most extraordinary campaigns in ancient history, not from the sea, but across the frozen peaks of the Alps, with elephants, infantry, and an oath etched deep in his heart. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE, and it carried with it the echo of something older, a rivalry not just of armies, but of philosophies. Hannibal moved with brilliance and speed. He won at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, where Roman forces were encircled and devastated. For a moment, it seemed the Republic might fall, but Rome did not crumble. It retreated, rebuilt, and adapted once more. Under the leadership of Scipio Africanus, the Republic struck back, not by chasing Hannibal, but by crossing the sea and threatening Carthage itself. In 202 BCE, at Zama, Carthage was defeated. The war was over, but the memory lingered. Rome had won, but the cost was deep. The countryside had been ravaged. The Republic had become more centralized, more militarized, more hardened. Carthage, for its part, remained a shell of its former self, still alive, but weakened, its fleet dismantled, its future dim. And yet, Rome watched it still. Suspicion, once kindled, does not fade easily. In 149 BCE, during a final moment of perceived threat, Rome launched the Third Punic War, a short, brutal siege that ended with the city's destruction. The ruins of Carthage were left smoldering beneath African skies, its silence echoing longer than its voice ever had. The Punic Wars shaped Rome not only in geography, but in spirit. They marked the end of one phase, the quiet, cautious republic, and the beginning of something larger, more ambitious, and more restless. Rome now touched 3 continents. It had learned to govern distant provinces, to manage tribute, and to plant its legions far from home. It had seen itself nearly undone and had emerged more resolute. But in doing so, it had changed. What had begun as a city defending its neighbors had become a state that could not help but expand. And across the Mediterranean, the sea that had once belonged to Carthage now shimmered with Roman sails. The Republic stood taller than ever before, but also, perhaps, more alone. In the soft evening light, the Roman Forum still appeared eternal, its columns casting long shadows across the worn stones, its temples bathed in the quiet gold of dusk. But beneath that surface, the pulse of the Republic had begun to change. What had once been a city of balance, guided by custom and compromise, was now a place of widening divides. Wealth had grown, so had Rome's reach. But with each province conquered, with each victory, parade, and tribute shipment, the delicate threads that once held the Republic together began to fray, not with noise, but with tension, pulled taut beneath the silence. After the Punic Wars, Rome emerged not only as a victor, but as a Mediterranean power. Provinces in Spain, North Africa, and Greece were now governed from afar. Grain poured in from Sicily and Egypt. Gold arrived from Macedonian treasuries. Slaves, taken as war captives, flooded the markets. The economy expanded, but not evenly. Great estates, latifundia, began to spread across the countryside, often formed from lands seized during wartime. These estates were worked not by free citizens, but by vast numbers of enslaved people, changing the fabric of Roman agriculture. Small farmers, once the sturdy backbone of the Republic and its army, struggled to compete. Many sold their land and drifted into the city, seeking work, shelter, or simply survival. Rome's population swelled. The city grew more crowded, noisier, and harder to manage. Insulae, multi-story apartment buildings, rose quickly to house the influx of displaced citizens. They were often cheaply built, prone to fire and collapse, their staircases steep and dark. The urban poor, once scattered, began to cluster. Bread and grain subsidies became a necessity. The Republic's famed equality among citizens had always been imperfect, but now it showed its deepest cracks. Wealth pooled in the hands of a few elite families, whose names became as permanent as the marble monuments they funded. In the Senate, voices grew louder, not in passion, but in rivalry. Senators vied not only for honor, but for influence over provinces, contracts, and military commands. Ambition, once tempered by custom, now found new fuel. And outside the Senate, a different kind of voice began to rise, that of the populares, politicians who claimed to speak for the common people, challenging the traditional power of the aristocratic optimates. The Republic, once a single body, was quietly dividing into factions, not through civil war, not yet, but through ideology, resentment, and memory. One of the first to sound the alarm was Tiberius Gracchus. In 133 BCE, as a tribune of the plebs, he proposed redistributing land to the poor, a return, he believed, to the smallholding roots of Roman strength. His intentions were not revolutionary, but restorative, yet the reaction was fierce. Senators saw a threat to their property, to their control. In a chaotic moment, Tiberius was killed, clubbed to death by a mob of senators. It was the first political assassination in the Republic's history, and it would not be the last. His brother, Gaius Gracchus, would take up the cause a decade later with more sweeping reforms, including subsidies for grain and judicial oversight of the Senate. His proposals gained popular support but met the same resistance. In 121 BCE, during a period of political violence, he too was killed. The deaths of the Gracchi were not just tragedies, they were turning points. The Republic had shown it could no longer settle disputes with debate alone. Blood had touched the forum's stones. In the years that followed, unrest deepened. Veterans returning from war found little support. The divide between rich and poor widened further. Political offices were increasingly sought not for service, but for power. Ambitious generals began to see themselves not only as servants of the state, but as forces in their own right. One such figure was Gaius Marius, a talented commander who reformed the Roman army. He opened its ranks to landless citizens, offering them pay and the promise of land in return for service. This change, while practical, altered the relationship between soldier and state. Loyalty began to shift, not to the Senate, but to the general who paid their wages and secured their future. Marius would clash with another rising general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their rivalry escalated into open conflict, and for the first time in Roman history, a Roman army marched on Rome itself. Sulla seized power, declared himself dictator, and purged his enemies. The Republic, which had long guarded itself against tyranny, now found its own laws turned inward, used not to protect liberty, but to silence dissent. Even after Sulla's resignation, the precedent lingered. Violence had become a political tool. The Senate's authority was no longer absolute, and Rome itself, once protected by its traditions and rituals, now carried the memory of internal war. Yet amid these shadows, daily life continued. Markets opened at dawn, lamps were lit at night, children played in courtyards, unaware of the tremors beneath their feet. The rituals of Rome endured, even as the Republic aged. But for those who watched closely, the signs were clear. Something had shifted. The Republic was no longer the stable experiment it had once been. It had grown, too large, too unequal, too fragile. The marble steps of the Forum remained smooth and worn, but the voices that echoed across them had changed. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had begun to lose its balance, and somewhere, just beyond the horizon, a new kind of leader would soon emerge. one born of ambition, opportunity, and the silence left behind by failing systems. When Gaius Julius Caesar first stepped into the world of Roman politics, the Republic was already beginning to lean into the wind. The structures still stood, the Senate still met, the consuls still served, and the rituals of governance unfolded in their proper sequence. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The balance that had once defined the Republic had tilted. Power now moved not solely through the Senate's chambers, but through the loyalty of armies, the weight of money, and the pull of personal charisma. Into this delicate moment walked Caesar, not with force at first, but with fluency. He understood the language of tradition. He also understood its quiet erosion. Born in 100 BCE into a patrician family with a fading legacy, Caesar was not immediately destined for greatness. His early years were marked by modest appointments and careful navigation of Rome's fractious political world. He was ambitious, yes, but not reckless. He aligned himself with the populares, those who spoke for the people against the entrenched power of the Senate. And he built his support not in the temples of the elite, but in the streets and assemblies where common citizens gathered. He dressed finely, spoke with grace, and remembered names. His presence was rarely loud, but it was never unnoticed. In 60 BCE, Caesar formed a quiet alliance that would shape the Republic's fate. Alongside Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Crassus, its wealthiest citizen, he entered into an informal political arrangement historians would later call the First Triumvirate. It was not a legal office, but a shared understanding, a private axis of influence that bypassed the usual checks and balances. Each man gained something. Pompey received land for his veterans, Crassus received favorable tax policies for his clients, and Caesar received the prized military command in Gaul. It was in Gaul, the broad lands beyond the Alps, that Caesar's star rose quickly and undeniably. Over nearly a decade, he led campaigns that expanded Roman territory deep into what is now France and Belgium, reaching even the misty shores of Britain. His victories were not just military, they were political. Each conquest brought glory, wealth, and most importantly, loyalty. His legions revered him. He marched with them, suffered with them, and rewarded them. Letters from the front, carefully curated, trickled back to Rome, building a legend even before his return. His commentaries, written in a clear and measured voice, told of battles and strategy, but also revealed a man crafting his own story with precision. Back in Rome, the political landscape shifted. Crassus fell in battle. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, grew uneasy with his partner's growing power. The Senate, wary of Caesar's popularity and military strength, demanded he relinquish his command and return to the city without his army. It was a test, one rooted in tradition, meant to preserve the Republic's fragile order. But Caesar hesitated. He knew that obedience would mean vulnerability, possibly prosecution, and political exile. The old rules no longer offered safety. And so, in 49 BCE, he made a quiet but irreversible decision. On a cold January night, Caesar and his army approached the Rubicon, a shallow river marking the northern boundary of Roman Italy. Crossing it with armed forces was forbidden, a gesture of civil war. For a moment, history stood still. Then Caesar crossed. No speeches, no declarations, just a step forward. The Republic, as it had existed, would never be the same. What followed was not a quick unraveling, but a slow, deliberate contest. Pompey fled to the east, gathering allies. Caesar pursued not in haste, but with purpose. Battles were fought at Pharsalus, at Thapsus, at Munda. Each victory tightened Caesar's hold on power. Yet through it all, he maintained a veneer of legality. He took the title of dictator, but claimed it was temporary. He respected the Senate, but reshaped its membership. He ruled, but he did so in a way that echoed the old ways, even as he quietly rewrote them. In 46 BCE, Caesar returned to Rome, victorious and unopposed. He was named dictator for 10 years, then for life. He passed reforms, debt relief, land for veterans, a new calendar to mark time with greater accuracy. He hosted games and feasts, lowered taxes, and planned projects to beautify the city. To many, he was a savior. To others, he was something else. A man drifting too close to monarchy in a city that remembered kings with unease. And then, on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, beneath the high ceilings of the theatre of Pompeii, Caesar fell. Not on a battlefield, but in the Senate chamber, surrounded by men who had once called him friend. The dagger was not wielded by the mob, but by senators, Brutus, Cassius, others. They believed perhaps that in killing Caesar, they were saving the Republic, that with his fall, the old balance might return. But the Republic they sought to revive no longer lived in the stones of the Forum or the scrolls of the Senate. It had faded long before Caesar's rise, eroded by inequality, by violence, by ambition. His death did not restore what was lost. It only marked the end of an era that had already begun to slip away. In the days that followed, Rome was silent. The streets held their breath. And somewhere beyond the city, others waited, watching the moment, feeling the void left behind by the man who had crossed a river and changed everything. In the days after Julius Caesar's death, Rome did not erupt. It whispered. Whispers in the streets, in doorways, in the marble corridors of the Senate. Whispers of uncertainty, revenge, and inheritance. The man who had crossed the Rubicon was gone, but the questions he left behind remained like smoke hanging in the air. Who would take his place? Could the Republic return to its older rhythms? Or had something irreversible already occurred? Caesar's assassins, men like Brutus and Cassius, believed themselves saviors of liberty, but they had misjudged the city's mood. The people, many of whom had benefited from Caesar's reforms and generosity, did not cheer his death. They mourned. At his funeral, staged with theatrical care, Caesar's body was displayed in the Forum. A wax effigy, suspended on a rotating platform, showed the 43 stab wounds, each one casting its own quiet accusation. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and co-consul, spoke with fiery sorrow. He read Caesar's will aloud, revealing generous bequests to the Roman people. The crowd, stirred into grief and anger, turned on the assassins. Brutus and Cassius fled the city they thought they had saved. Antony, for a moment, held the reins of power. He was charismatic, experienced, and had the army's respect. But another figure soon emerged, one quieter, younger, and far less expected. Gaius Octavius, barely 19, was Caesar's great-nephew and named heir. No one had thought him significant, yet he moved with unusual care. He took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus and began gathering support, not through bold gestures, but through quiet alliances and measured promises. He played the part of the dutiful son, honoring Caesar's memory while carefully stepping into the space his death had left behind. What followed was not immediate conflict, but a slow shifting of positions. Octavian and Antony were not yet enemies. For a time, they shared power, joined by Marcus Lepidus in what became known as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the earlier informal alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this new triumvirate was official, backed by law, given sweeping powers to restore the Republic, though it did quite the opposite. They began with purges. Enemies of the state, many of them senators, poets, philosophers, were named on public lists and executed. Properties were seized. Fear returned to the city's core, not in fire or mobs, but in quiet knocks at the door. Meanwhile, Brutus and Cassius had regrouped in the eastern provinces, raising legions and rallying support. In 42 BCE, at the Battle of Philippi, the armies of the triumvirate met those of the assassins. It was not a single clash, but a drawn-out campaign. Brutus and Cassius were ultimately defeated, both dying by suicide. The last flicker of Republican idealism, however flawed, was extinguished on a distant field. With their enemies gone, the triumvirs divided the Roman world. Antony took the east, Octavian governed the west, Lepidus was sidelined. What began as partnership quickly shifted into rivalry. Antony, drawn to Egypt and its queen, Cleopatra VII, began to drift further from Roman sensibilities. His relationship with Cleopatra was not just romantic, it was political. Together, they envisioned a new kind of power, one that blended Roman ambition with Eastern wealth and mystique. To many in Rome, it felt like a betrayal. Octavian, ever strategic, stayed behind in the city. He cultivated his image carefully, modest in appearance, respectful of tradition, generous to veterans. He used propaganda with quiet precision, circulating stories of Antony's excesses, of his foreign queen, of his imagined plans to abandon Rome for Alexandria. Whether true or not, the stories took root. Public opinion, slowly but surely, turned. In 32 BCE, war was declared, not against Antony directly, but against Cleopatra. It was a war staged as defense of Roman values, though it was, at its heart, a final struggle for control. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, a naval clash off the coast of western Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was larger, but disorganized. Octavian's commander, Marcus Agrippa, maneuvered with calm effectiveness. Antony's forces crumbled. The lovers fled. A year later, both took their own lives in Alexandria, leaving Octavian alone atop the Roman world. And yet even now, Octavian did not declare himself king. He understood the power of appearances. The Republic, at least in form, still mattered to the Roman people. In 27 BCE, he returned power to the Senate, a carefully choreographed gesture. The Senate, in turn, granted him new titles: Augustus, meaning the revered one, and Princeps, or first citizen. It was not a throne, but it carried the weight of one. The Republic had not ended in fire. It had softened, shifted, and become something new. A single man now held the reins of Rome, not as dictator, not as monarch, but as emperor in all but name. Octavian had done what Caesar could not. He had claimed ultimate power, not by defying the Republic, but by gently absorbing it. The old offices still existed. The Senate still met. But all roads, all decisions, all futures now led through him. The long twilight of the Republic had ended. In its place, the empire quietly began to rise, not with a coronation, but with a nod, a title, and a new dawn breaking over the Tiber. When Augustus stood before the Senate in 27 BCE, cloaked in modest white robes and framed by the cool light of early morning, he did not declare dominion. He offered restoration. In a carefully crafted gesture, he claimed to relinquish extraordinary powers, to return control to the Senate and the people. But those watching closely knew what had shifted. The Republic was not reborn. It had been gently folded into something new. Augustus did not seize the empire. He became its caretaker, its architect. And with that, Rome entered its next breath, one quieter than war, more ordered than revolution, the beginning of the Roman Empire. He took the title Princeps, meaning first citizen, a subtle echo of republican equality. But behind this modest mask lay near total authority. Augustus controlled the army, directed foreign policy, and steered the laws of the land. Yet he moved gently. He respected tradition, restored temples, and filled public spaces with beauty and balance. He understood that peace required more than the absence of conflict. It required rhythm, reassurance, and the soft weight of continuity. After decades of civil war, what the Roman people craved most was stability. Augustus gave them that in abundance. He reformed the tax system, stabilized the currency, and expanded the grain supply. He rebuilt aqueducts and roads, ensuring that fresh water and trade flowed into every corner of the city. He founded colonies for veterans, not as tokens, but as enduring settlements, seeds of Roman culture scattered across the provinces. And all the while, he maintained the facade of republican institutions. Consuls still served, the Senate still debated, but always under his careful gaze. The city itself transformed. Marble replaced brick, as Augustus famously claimed. Public works flourished, new forums, theatres, temples. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, was erected to honour the calm he had brought. Its delicate reliefs depicted processions not of conquest, but of family, fertility, and prosperity. The empire was not presented as a machine of dominance, but as a garden in full bloom, cultivated by a patient hand. Augustus also wove morality into the fabric of his rule. He passed laws encouraging marriage, childbirth, and traditional Roman values. Adultery became a public offense. Lavish displays of wealth were frowned upon. In these measures, he was both ruler and reformer, gently nudging Roman society toward a vision of disciplined order. The family, the home, the temple, these became his instruments of harmony. Where Caesar had ruled through speed and spectacle, Augustus governed through quiet design. Yet, even in this age of order, Augustus knew the power of image. He surrounded himself with poets and artists who helped shape the narrative of his reign. Virgil, commissioned to write a national epic, composed the Aeneid, the story of a Trojan hero who sailed west and founded the Roman people. It was a myth of destiny, linking Augustus to the gods, to Rome's divine origin. History, poetry, and power blended into a single voice. Through stories, Augustus gently rewrote the past, not to erase the Republic, but to enshrine the empire as its natural heir. While Rome itself prospered, Augustus turned his attention to the provinces. His empire stretched from Spain to Syria, from the Alps to the sands of North Africa. Some regions were governed directly by the Senate, others by imperial administrators under his authority. Roads and postal systems tightened the web of control. Troops were stationed at key borders, not in conquest, but in quiet vigilance. The frontiers were not walls, but thresholds, and Augustus watched them carefully, adjusting policies with a steady hand. But even the age of peace was not without loss. In 9 CE, 3 Roman legions were ambushed and destroyed in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic tribes, a devastating blow that reminded Rome of its limits. Augustus, upon hearing the news, was said to have cried out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Yet he did not launch reckless retaliation. He tightened the borders, fortified the Rhine, and accepted that the empire, though vast, could not be infinite. In his final years, Augustus grew reflective. He curated his legacy with care, writing a document known as the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the deeds of the divine Augustus. It listed his accomplishments not in triumphalist tones, but in calm, declarative lines. The buildings he restored, the enemies he subdued, the peace he sustained. It was a farewell, written like a ledger, quiet and composed. When he died in 14 CE, after more than 4 decades of rule, Rome did not erupt into chaos. The transition to his adopted son, Tiberius, was largely smooth. The empire had endured its first transfer of power. A system, delicate but functional, had been formed. And so the age of Augustus passed not like a falling tower, but like a setting sun. Its light lingered on statues, on scrolls, on the white stones of roads that reached beyond the horizon. It was not a time of loud glory, but of whispered permanence. The Republic was gone, but something else remained. Something quieter, more controlled, and built not on revolution, but on reform. Rome now belonged to emperors. But for a while, it still believed it belonged to itself. For nearly 2 centuries following the rise of Augustus, the Roman Empire entered a kind of peace not often known to human history. Not the absence of hardship, but the absence of collapse. This period, remembered as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, was not defined by grand battles or political drama, but by rhythm. The steady pulse of roads stretching outward, of laws applied evenly across distance, of marketplaces opening and closing like eyelids in every province of the empire. It was not perfect, but it was, for a time, stable. From the windswept highlands of Britannia to the sun-baked cities of Egypt, from the riverbanks of the Danube to the trade routes of Syria, the empire's vastness became familiar. Not to all, and not equally, but to many. Roman roads, built with mathematical precision, cut through forests and over mountains, linking far-off lands with the center like arteries from a great heart. Milestones marked distance. Way stations offered shelter. Couriers moved on horseback, delivering messages written on scrolls, carried between governors, legates, and emperors with impressive speed. This was not conquest, this was connection. The empire's borders, though not unchallenged, were largely secure. Legions were stationed strategically, not roving bands of conquest, but garrisons of vigilance. Along the Rhine and Danube, watchtowers stood in quiet alert. In Judea, Dacia, and Mauritania, forts rose above valleys, not only as threats but as promises of order, of Roman presence. Locals sometimes resented the watchful eye of Rome, but just as often they relied on it. Banditry decreased, piracy was checked. Trade routes flowed more freely than they had for centuries. Within this stability, the rhythms of life became more predictable. In cities large and small, the familiar markers of Roman presence took shape. Baths, forums, amphitheaters, temples. A traveler might walk through Lyon, Carthage, Antioch, or Cologne and find similar structures, familiar rituals. The scent of oil in the bathhouse, the murmur of voices in the law courts, the click of sandals on tiled floors. Each province remained distinct in language and custom, yet Rome provided a shared frame, not a single culture, but a common stage upon which many could perform their daily lives. Latin spread westward, Greek continued to flourish in the east. Bilingual inscriptions adorned buildings. Coins stamped with the emperor's likeness traveled from hand to hand, from one coast to another. And with them came the subtle understanding that Rome was everywhere. Not only a city, but a condition. A way of measuring time, managing property, resolving disputes. The 12 tables were no longer the only law. New codes adapted to new needs, but the principle remained. The law was above any one man, and it could be written, carried, and trusted. Emperors came and went, but most in this era ruled not through spectacle, but through steadiness. Tiberius, Claudius, Vespasian, Trajan, and Hadrian each carried forward the systems Augustus had built. Some expanded the empire's reach, others focused inward, but none unraveled what had been so carefully tied. Trajan extended the empire to its furthest size, reaching into Dacia and deepening the empire's eastern footprint. Hadrian, in contrast, chose consolidation. He built walls, most famously in northern Britain, not to isolate, but to define. His journeys across the empire became legend as he sought not to command from afar, but to walk the roads himself, to see the cities and peoples who called Rome their own. Commerce flourished. Ships carried grain from Alexandria to Ostia, where it was unloaded and measured in giant public warehouses. Olive oil from Hispania, glass from Syria, silk from lands beyond the empire's eastern edge, all made their way into Roman homes. Markets bustled not just in the capital, but in outposts once thought remote. A woman in Ephesus might wear a brooch cast in Gaul. A teacher in Leptis Magna might quote Virgil to students who spoke Berber at home. This too was the Pax Romana, a web of quiet interdependence. And through it all, Rome remained both close and far. Most people living within its borders would never see the capital, never walk its 7 hills, or hear the roar of the Colosseum, but they would know its measures. They would feel its weight in the court ruling, the census count, the grain shipment that arrived in time for winter. They would speak of the imperator, not always with love, but often with familiarity, as one speaks of weather, of something too vast to change but ever present. Still, this peace was not without tension. Rebellions flared, most famously the Jewish revolts in Judea, which challenged Roman rule and led to great destruction, including the fall of the Second Temple. Elsewhere, local uprisings were quickly quieted. The price of order was often paid in silence, in cultural loss, in deference. Not all subjects of Rome felt peace as a gift. For some, it was a ceiling. For others, a structure within which they found room to grow. But across the decades, the empire held. Generations lived and died without seeing Rome at war with itself. Roads were repaired, aqueducts maintained, law courts opened. Fathers taught sons how to read. Mothers passed down family gods and household rituals. The calendar moved with familiar festivals, Saturnalia, Lupercalia, Parentalia, each blending the sacred with the social, each a thread in the long cloth of Roman life. It was not a utopia, but it was rare and fragile and very real. The Pax Romana would not last forever. But while it did, it gave the world a glimpse of something precious, not conquest, but calm, not dominance, but order. A moment in which roads, laws, and the simple act of living stretched outward from a single city to the edge of the known world, and stayed. Beneath the grandeur of temples and the decrees of emperors, Roman spirituality moved softly through daily life. It hummed in kitchens, glowed in lanterns, and lingered in the hands of those who made quiet offerings before the dawn. For most Romans, religion was not a set of strict beliefs or dramatic revelations. It was a rhythm, a way of ordering life through gestures, calendars, and the subtle acknowledgement of unseen forces. The divine was everywhere, but rarely loud. In every Roman home, no matter how modest, a small shrine stood near the hearth. This was the lararium, the sacred space for the lares and penates, household spirits who watched over family and fire. Figurines of these protective beings, often dressed like modest Roman youths, stood within niches or on shelves. Offerings of food, wine, incense, or oil were left regularly, not as acts of desperation, but as part of the expected flow of the day. To light a fire without acknowledging the lares was unthinkable. To eat without a nod of thanks to the penates felt incomplete. These small rituals did not require priests or temples. They were carried by the hands of mothers, fathers, children, binding each home to something greater. The gods of the Roman state, by contrast, were grander in name and scope. Jupiter, king of the gods, ruled from the Capitoline Hill alongside Juno and Minerva, the three forming the Capitoline Triad. Their temples loomed above the Forum, visible reminders of Roman order and power. Yet even these gods were approached with quiet ceremony. Public rituals, sacrifices, festivals, processions were not moments of frenzy, but of precision. Every gesture had a place. Every word spoken to the gods had to be correct. A priest who stumbled or misspoke during a ritual would begin again from the start, no matter how far into the ceremony. In Roman eyes, divine favor was not won through passion, but through correctness. A well-performed rite ensured harmony between mortals and gods. The calendar itself was deeply religious. Days were marked not only for work or rest, but by whether certain acts were permitted. On dies fasti, legal matters could proceed. On dies nefasti, they could not. Festivals punctuated the year, each one tethered to myth, agriculture, or the changing seasons. Saturnalia, celebrated in December, turned the social order on its head for a few days. Slaves dined like masters, gambling was allowed, and gifts were exchanged in joy. Parentalia, in February, was dedicated to honoring the dead. Families visited tombs, shared meals in their memory, and spoke softly to those who had passed beyond the veil. Priests and priestesses served specific functions, often drawn from Rome's elite families. The Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, held enormous symbolic power, a role that Augustus himself would later claim. Vestal virgins, among the most sacred servants of the Roman state, tended the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Chosen as young girls, they lived in a cloistered residence near the Forum and took vows of chastity and devotion for 30 years. Their flame represented not only the goddess, but the city itself. As long as it burned, Rome endured. Its extinguishing was seen as a grave omen, a breach between the mortal and divine. And yet, Roman religion was not static. It absorbed. From its earliest days, Rome welcomed foreign gods and customs, not with indifference, but with curiosity and calculation. If a foreign deity seemed powerful or useful, it was often incorporated into Roman practice. Cybele, the Great Mother from Phrygia. Isis, the Egyptian goddess of renewal. Even Mithras, a Persian deity popular among soldiers, all found their way into Roman temples and hearts. These cults offered something different, more personal, more mysterious, sometimes promising life after death. While the traditional Roman gods governed civic order, these imported deities spoke to private longing and individual hope. Divination, too, played a quiet role in guiding decisions. Augurs interpreted the flight of birds, the crackling of flames, or the entrails of sacrificed animals to discern the will of the gods. Nothing important happened in the state, no battle declared, no treaty signed, without consulting these signs. Romans did not seek certainty, they sought reassurance. To move forward without the gods was to court imbalance. But Roman spirituality was not only about pleasing the divine, it was also about remembering the dead. Ancestors were ever present. In homes, death masks of forebears, imagines, were kept and displayed. During funerals and special ceremonies, they were sometimes worn by living relatives in silent processions, bringing the past into the present. Family was not limited to the living. It stretched backward through time, a lineage of names and faces that anchored each Roman to a broader story. And yet, even in this deeply religious society, belief was rarely rigid. Philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism gained followers, especially among the educated. Some Romans questioned the gods, others reinterpreted them. But few abandoned ritual. To honor the gods was to be Roman. To attend festivals, to mark the calendar, to pour the wine at the proper time. These acts were not merely spiritual. They were cultural, civic, and social. They were how Rome remembered itself. So each day, across the empire, these quiet gestures continued. A small flame lit before a meal, a whisper at a tomb, a garland hung above a doorway on a festival day. These were the soft threads that tied a vast world together, not through law or force, but through shared reverence. The gods may have seemed distant, but their presence was always near, felt not in thunder, but in habit. In the calm of the Pax Romana, as the roads stretched on and the borders held firm, it was these rituals, simple, daily, remembered, that gave Rome its spirit. A spirit rooted not just in conquest, but in communion. Not in the loud voices of emperors, but in the quiet prayers of millions whispered into the firelight. In the early hours of a Roman morning, as the city stirred and carts rattled over cobblestones, another kind of rhythm awakened, one not of ritual or commerce, but of expectation. Rome, the great city of order and conquest, was also a city of entertainment. Laughter, cheers, and gasps of delight echoed through its stone corridors. Yet this was not merely a city at play. It was a city watching itself, its strength, its unity, and its tensions, reflected in the spectacles it staged. To entertain the masses was not only to distract them, but to soothe them, to shape them, and in subtle ways, to rule them. The most iconic of Rome's amusements took place in the amphitheatres, stone arenas where crowds gathered to watch ludi, public games, contests, and performances. The Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheatre, was the grandest of them all. Completed in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, it rose like a massive stone shell, layered with columns and arches, capable of holding over 50,000 spectators. But smaller amphitheatres dotted the empire as well, in cities from Verona to Arles, each a reflection of Rome's broader identity, structure, hierarchy, and performance. Here, gladiatores, often slaves, prisoners, or volunteers seeking fame, fought in carefully staged bouts. Contrary to modern imagination, not every contest ended in death. Many were displays of skill, of endurance, of theatrical tension. The crowd, engaged and vocal, could influence outcomes with its collective voice. Thumbs down or up, gestures debated by historians, represented not just life or death, but participation in power. The emperor, seated in a reserved box, watched not only the arena, but the crowd. Their pleasure was his stability. Yet the games were only part of a wider cultural offering. Chariot races, held in the Circus Maximus, drew even larger crowds. Teams raced in coloured factions, the reds, whites, greens and blues, and spectators adopted fierce loyalties. Horses thundered down the long course, turning perilously at the curved ends, where crashes, known as naufragia, were most likely. The tension was real. Fortunes were made and lost in wagers. Drivers, many from humble origins, could become celebrities, their names chanted through the streets, their faces painted on tavern walls. Even outside these grand venues, entertainment permeated daily life. Theatre, with roots in Greek tradition, flourished in Rome. Comedies by Plautus and Terence offered sharp wit and familiar characters. Clever slaves, boastful soldiers, mistaken lovers, presented in bustling public theatres. Tragedies too were performed, though often for more elite audiences, steeped in myth and moral reflection. These plays were not only diversions, they mirrored society's concerns, celebrated its values, and occasionally critiqued its failings, always wrapped in laughter or pathos, safe within the structure of performance. Music and dance, though less formally documented, were present in many forms. In private homes, in taverns, during festivals. Flutes, lyres, drums, and cymbals created a soft backdrop to banquets and rituals alike. Professional entertainers, including mimes, acrobats, and storytellers, traveled between cities, performing in markets, or hired for private gatherings. Their art was ephemeral, improvised, and unrecorded, but it lived in the memories of those who watched and smiled. And then there were the public baths, perhaps the most quintessential Roman blend of leisure and social ritual. More than places to cleanse the body, they were spaces of conversation, relaxation, and belonging. Men and women, on alternating schedules or in separate facilities, would spend hours moving through a sequence of rooms: the apoditerium for undressing, the tepidarium for warmth, the caldarium for steaming heat, and finally, the frigidarium for a cold plunge. Massages, haircuts, and meals were often available. Libraries, gardens, and lecture spaces adjoined many bath complexes. For the average Roman, rich or poor, these baths offered not just hygiene, but community, a place where senators and freedmen might share the same air, if not the same circle. Behind all of this lay a quiet strategy. Roman emperors understood that entertainment was a tool of governance. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, captured this wisdom. Grain doles kept stomachs full. Games kept minds occupied. When the forum was restless, a well-timed spectacle could restore calm. This was not cynical manipulation alone. It was also generosity, pride, and a shared experience that bound a diverse population into a single moment of attention. In the provinces, these customs spread as well. Amphitheatres, circuses, theatres, and baths appeared across the empire, adapted to local tastes, but unmistakably Roman in spirit. A citizen in Tarragona, Caesarea, or Londinium could find the same rituals of leisure as one in Rome. These institutions became more than architecture. They became promises of inclusion, of access to the rhythms of Roman life. Yet the world beyond the arena never stopped. Wars continued on the borders. Plots simmered in the palaces. But inside the Colosseum, inside the baths for a time, all was suspended. The cheers of the crowd, the laughter in the theatre, the splash of water in a marble pool. These were the softer threads of Roman cohesion, the spaces where power and people coexisted not in command, but in participation. So the games continued, decade after decade. They marked festivals, celebrated victories, and remembered the dead. They offered escape, identity, and sometimes a reflection of deeper truths. For Rome, entertainment was never just play. It was performance, of values, of hierarchy, of unity. It reminded Romans, gently and repeatedly, who they were. And as the sun set over the spires of the city, casting long shadows over empty seats and cooling water, a quiet stillness returned. Tomorrow, the games would resume. But tonight, Rome rested, entertained, pacified, and for the moment, whole. When Augustus died peacefully in 14 CE, he left behind more than monuments and a legacy of peace. He left behind a question that would echo through the centuries of empire to follow. Who would rule after him? The Republic had no hereditary kingship, and though Augustus had carefully structured his powers, they were tied to his person, not his blood. There were no clear laws of succession, no coronations, no royal families in the traditional sense, and yet Rome had become an empire, and empires need rulers. Augustus had adopted Tiberius, his stepson, long before his death, preparing the way with slow, deliberate gestures, shared offices, public appearances, official endorsements. Tiberius, experienced and cautious, was accepted not through acclaim, but through resignation. Rome had grown used to one man above the rest. Tiberius did not inspire warmth. He ruled with silence, suspicion, and increasing distance, retreating in later years to the island of Capri. Yet the system held. The Senate still functioned, the people still ate, the empire still ran. Power had become a thing quietly passed, not seized. And so a pattern began, not of clear succession, but of adaptation. Some emperors were sons, others adopted heirs. Some were named in a will, others acclaimed by the army or confirmed by the Senate. The early dynasty, called the Julio-Claudian line, included emperors both competent and cruel. Caligula, Tiberius's grandnephew, began with promise, but soon unraveled into excess and unpredictability. His assassination in 41 CE was met with confusion. The Senate hesitated. The guards acted. And suddenly, Claudius, once mocked for his stammer and limp, was found hiding behind a curtain and declared emperor. Claudius ruled with quiet efficiency. A scholar more than a soldier, he expanded the empire into Britannia, reformed the bureaucracy, and opened high offices to men from the provinces. But power in Rome was never simple. Behind every emperor stood a web of freedmen, generals, wives, and advisors, all with ambitions of their own. Claudius was eventually poisoned, likely by his fourth wife Agrippina the Younger, who sought the throne for her son, Nero. Nero's reign began under careful guidance. He was young, poetic, well-educated. The early years were marked by capable administration under Seneca and Burrus, his tutors. But as he matured, Nero withdrew from governance and turned toward performance. Theatre, music, and spectacle. His artistic ambitions became legend, his paranoia grew, and his cruelty deepened. The deaths of his mother, his wife, and several senators followed. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, whether or not he caused it, became a symbol of imperial neglect. When Nero was declared a public enemy in 68 CE, he fled and took his own life, the first emperor to do so. With Nero's death, the fragile pattern broke. For a brief and turbulent period, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, rival generals claimed the throne: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Their rise was not determined by lineage or law, but by armies, by the loyalty of legions, and the swiftness of action. Rome learned that emperors could be made in the provinces, far from the forum. Vespasian, a practical man from a modest background, restored order and began the Flavian dynasty. He built the Colosseum on the ruins of Nero's palace, a gesture both symbolic and strategic, returning leisure to the people where vanity once stood. Vespasian's sons followed: Titus, who ruled briefly and gently, and Domitian, who governed effectively but grew increasingly autocratic. Domitian's assassination in 96 CE marked another quiet turning point, not of rebellion, but of whispered discontent within the palace itself. The Senate, eager to reclaim a sense of influence, turned to a respected elder, Nerva. And so began what would later be remembered as the Five Good Emperors, a period of unusually stable, capable leadership, built not on bloodlines, but on adoption and merit. Trajan, Nerva's adopted heir, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, bringing Dacia and parts of the Middle East under Roman rule. Yet his successor, Hadrian, reversed course, choosing consolidation over conquest. Hadrian valued architecture, philosophy, and governance. He traveled extensively, visiting nearly every province, and left behind structures that still stand today. Most famously, Hadrian's Wall in Britannia. Under Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, the empire maintained its equilibrium. Marcus, a philosopher emperor, wrote meditations in the midst of war, reflections not on conquest, but on virtue, impermanence, and duty. But Marcus Aurelius broke the pattern. Rather than adopt a successor, he passed the throne to his biological son, Commodus. His reign, marked by vanity and theatrical excess, revealed the risks of dynastic inheritance. When he was eventually assassinated, Rome again teetered on the edge of uncertainty. Throughout these centuries, the question remained: who decides, who rules? The Senate claimed a role, but its influence waxed and waned. The people cheered or jeered, but rarely chose. The army, stationed in the provinces far from Rome, often held the real power. A general beloved by his troops could become emperor in days. And so the succession was never guaranteed. It required performance, legitimacy, and luck. Still, the empire endured. Its systems of taxation, law, and infrastructure held strong. Emperors came and went, some better, some worse. But the machine of Rome moved on. Behind each ruler stood thousands of scribes, magistrates, and local governors. The quiet machinery of administration that outlived individual ambition. And so, while imperial power shimmered at the surface, it was always shaped by deeper currents of inheritance and interruption, of the center and the provinces, of spectacle and silence. Rome did not crown its emperors. It found them, named them, feared them, and sometimes forgot them. But each one, in turn, shaped the empire just a little, until one day the center would no longer hold. Far from the Roman Forum and the shadow of the Palatine Hill, the empire continued, not in echoes, but in steady rhythms of its own. In the outer provinces, where wild seas met stony coastlines, where mountains faded into plains, and where distant languages still hummed in marketplaces, the Roman presence took a different form. It was not the Rome of senators and emperors. It was a Rome built of stone streets, public baths, boundary markers, and the soft sway of daily rituals shared across thousands of miles. The provinces were not just territories, they were homes, places with their own histories long before Rome arrived. Some, like Gaul, had been lands of Celtic tribes, of hill forts, druids, and regional kings. Others, like Egypt, bore the memory of pharaohs and ancient temples carved in sun-bleached limestone. Even as Rome imposed its systems of law, architecture, and taxation, these older currents never vanished. They simply blended into something new, something distinctly Roman, yet still local. In cities like Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Tarraco, Tarragona, or Tarsus, the presence of Rome could be seen and felt in predictable ways. In the wide, gridded streets, the theatres shaped like half-moons, the forums lined with colonnades. Local elites were often invited into Roman citizenship, creating a class of provincial Romans who dressed in togas, spoke Latin or Greek, and governed under Roman law. These elites became Rome's quiet agents, not through conquest, but through continuity. They sponsored temples, hosted festivals, and ensured that the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor's genius or divine spirit, was honored on local altars. But for most people in the provinces, life was less about empire and more about pattern. Farmers rose with the sun, tending to olives in Hispania, to vines in Gaul, to sheep in the hills of Anatolia. Markets opened in the shadow of temples. Artisans shaped pottery with local clay, but stamped it with Roman forms, a blend of old soil and new style. In the evenings, oil lamps flickered in quiet homes where Latin mixed with native dialects, and stories from Rome mingled with local legends. The spread of Roman citizenship was one of the empire's most transformative tools. It began as a privilege granted sparingly, then widened steadily over time. By the early 3rd century CE, under Emperor Caracalla, citizenship was extended to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. A gesture as symbolic as it was practical, it meant access to legal protections, the right to marry and own property under Roman law, and the quiet sense of belonging to something vast. A man in Numidia, a woman in Bithynia, a family in Britannia, all could now claim the same imperial identity, even as their accents, meals, and gods remained their own. Infrastructure carried this identity forward. Roman roads, expertly built and enduring, connected one province to the next. A traveller could walk from Carthago Nova to Athens, or from Colonia Agrippinensis, modern Cologne, to Alexandria, stopping at roadside inns, guided by milestones and maps etched on bronze. These routes carried more than soldiers or merchants. They carried messages, ideas, rumours, and memory. Local governance, too, reflected Rome's blended approach. Towns were often overseen by local councils, curiae, composed of local landowners or merchants, many of whom bore Roman names and used Roman titles. Taxes were collected, censuses taken, and justice administered, not always by Roman officials, but by locals trained in Roman methods. This allowed the empire to govern widely without stretching itself too thin. Rome did not need to remake every place in its image. It only needed to ensure that the rhythms aligned. Religious life in the provinces reflected a similar balance. Roman gods were introduced alongside local deities, temples to Mars, Minerva, or Jupiter. Optimus Maximus stood beside shrines to Isis, Celtic river gods, or Eastern mystery cults. In many cases, the lines blurred. A single altar might bear dedications to multiple gods, one Roman, one local, offered together, not in conflict, but in shared hope. In Britannia, for example, the native goddess Julius was merged with Minerva at the hot springs of Bath, forming a hybrid worship that drew pilgrims from near and far. In Asia Minor, the worship of Cybele and Mithras took deep root, especially among soldiers and the lower classes. These cults, with their private rituals and promises of rebirth, offered intimacy that the public gods could not. And in Judea, Rome faced a very different spiritual landscape, monotheistic, ancient, and resistant to outside interference. Tensions there would eventually spark revolts and reshape the religious history of the entire Mediterranean world. Yet, despite occasional unrest, most of the empire's provinces remained calm. The promise of peace, trade, and stability was powerful. Many who lived under Roman rule were born into it, never knowing a world before the roads and the aqueducts, the legal petitions and the festivals marked on Roman calendars. They were Roman by circumstance, and eventually by choice. In these far-flung corners, the empire breathed at a quieter pace. Emperors were distant, statues and coins more familiar than their actual faces. But the system, for a time, worked. Not by brute force alone, but by adaptation, by allowing local customs to live within a Roman frame. So the provinces endured, not in submission, but in rhythm. They were not Rome's shadow, but its reflection, varied, layered, and ever-changing. And as the sun set across distant fields and port cities, the same lamps were lit, the same roads travelled, the same stars observed, all beneath the quiet umbrella of a single name, Roma. At the farthest edges of the empire, where Roman stone met earth still wild and unbroken, the world felt different. The cities grew fewer, the language softened into local dialects, and the roads, so straight and certain in the heart of Rome, began to bend and narrow. These were the frontiers of the Roman world, called the limes, a word that once meant merely a path between fields, but came to signify the borders of a vast, expanding and slowly hardening empire. The frontiers were not lines in the sand, nor were they always walls. They were zones, broad regions where Roman influence ended, and something older, stranger, or simply different began. Here, the empire did not end with a cliff. It faded gradually, and in that soft fading, life continued, complex, practical, and deeply human. In Britannia, the northernmost province of the empire, the frontier was marked by one of Rome's most enduring monuments, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching over 70 miles from coast to coast, it was not just a military barrier, but a symbol, a line drawn across hills and moorland that said, "This far and no farther." Built in stone and turf during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, it was garrisoned by auxiliary troops, many of whom came from lands far from the cold winds of the north. Syrians, Gauls, Thracians, and Dacians lived here in wooden barracks, cooked meals in clay pots, and warmed themselves by braziers while scanning the horizon for movement. But the frontier was not only a military outpost, it was a place of exchange. Trade crossed the wall as easily as words and customs did. Local Britons, once enemies of Rome, adapted. Some settled near the forts, selling food, goods, or labor. Families formed. Children grew up speaking both Latin and the native tongue. Temples honored Roman gods beside local spirits of place and sky. The wall divided, but it also connected. This pattern repeated across the empire's edges. Along the Danube, forts dotted the riverbanks, anchoring a long, meandering frontier that cut through forest and field. Soldiers built bridges, manned watchtowers, and patrolled the quiet waters that separated Rome from the tribes beyond. Sarmatians, Goths, Dacians, each with their own customs, alliances, and tempers. The Danube was not just a river, it was a living border, sometimes tense, sometimes porous, always flowing. To the east, the empire faced its most formidable and sophisticated rival, Parthia, later replaced by the Sassanid Persian Empire. Here, in the arid landscapes of Syria, Mesopotamia, and the highlands of Armenia, Rome could not rely on superiority alone. Diplomacy, tribute, and careful treaties became essential. The cities of the eastern frontier, Dura, Europos, Palmyra, and Nisibis, thrived as trading hubs and cultural crossroads. Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and Persian were spoken in the same streets. Merchants offered silk from China, incense from Arabia, glassware from Alexandria. The frontier in the east shimmered more than bristled. In North Africa, the southern edge of the empire blurred into desert. Roman control faded into the dunes, where nomadic Berber tribes traveled beyond the reach of taxation or tribute. Yet even here, forts stood like lone sentinels, guarding caravan routes, water sources, and the fragile line between settled province and open expanse. Soldiers posted in these remote stations often adapted to local ways, wearing light tunics, rising with the sun, learning the land not as invaders, but as guests who might never leave. The men who guarded these borders, the auxilia, were not always Romans by birth. Many were provincial recruits granted citizenship after service. They brought their own gods, customs, and languages into the army, creating a force both disciplined and diverse. Alongside them lived families, wives, children, merchants, and laborers. Forts became communities, fields were planted, markets opened once a week. And so the frontier became not just a line, but a lived environment. Part military, part village, part dream. The experience of time itself changed at the edge. Messages from Rome arrived less often, sometimes months late. News traveled slowly. A change of emperor might go unnoticed for weeks. In the provinces, the presence of Rome was felt in taxes, in uniformed men, in public rites. But at the frontier, Rome felt more distant, more like a memory wrapped in stone, banners, and silence. Yet the frontiers were not failures. They held for centuries. They did not promise perfect safety. Raids occurred, walls were breached, forts abandoned and rebuilt, but they functioned. They gave Rome breathing room. They absorbed tension, allowed diplomacy, and defined identity. Behind the walls lay order. Beyond them, the unknown, sometimes hostile, often indifferent, always watching. And then slowly, that watching turned. In the 3rd century and beyond, pressures at the borders would mount. Migrating peoples, climate change, shifting alliances, all began to press inward. But for now, in the stillness of the High Empire, the frontiers held their shape. The torches were lit at dusk, the patrols made their rounds, and in the spaces between stone and soil, the empire whispered to itself, "Here we end, and here we continue." As the 3rd century dawned over the Roman world, the empire remained immense, paved in stone and memory, guarded by walls and law. The temples still stood. The roads still reached across mountains and marshes. Grain ships still arrived at Ostia. Yet beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. Not abruptly, but steadily, like wind carving stone. The systems that once moved with silent precision grew louder, less certain. Rome, it seemed, had grown too large, too fast, too long, and now it was beginning to forget how to hold itself. The crisis of the 3rd century, as it would later be called, was not a single event. It was a century of many fractures. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 emperors came and went, many dying not in bed, but by blade. Assassinations became common. Legions proclaimed their own commanders as emperors, often in distant provinces, forcing rival claims. Civil war followed civil war. The Senate, once the voice of order, grew increasingly irrelevant. Real power lay with the army, not in Rome, but wherever its legions happened to march. The crisis began with the death of Emperor Severus Alexander, a young ruler killed by his own troops in 235 CE. His successor, Maximinus Thrax, rose not from noble lineage, but from the barracks, a career soldier, rough and commanding. His reign marked the beginning of the so-called soldier emperors, men chosen by the military for strength, loyalty, or sheer circumstance. Most ruled only briefly. Some never made it to Rome. Their images appeared on coins, their names entered the record, and then, often violently, they vanished. This political instability brought other consequences. Provinces suffered neglect, frontiers wavered. In the east, the Sassanid Empire pushed westward, capturing key cities and defeating Roman forces. In the west, Germanic tribes tested the Rhine and Danube more frequently. Rome's borders, once firm, began to blur. Cities were sacked, roads grew dangerous, trade routes frayed, and in the interior, plague and famine occasionally returned, spreading quietly from port to port, hollowing out villages and families. But perhaps the most revealing cracks came not from outside invaders, but from within. In 260 CE, the empire briefly fractured. A Roman general named Postumus, stationed in Gaul, declared a breakaway state, the Gallic Empire, which included Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia. At the same time, in the east, the city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, carved out its own territory, stretching into Syria and Egypt. These were not barbarian incursions. They were Roman-led regions ruling Roman citizens, asserting autonomy when Rome itself seemed unable to protect or govern them. The empire had not been invaded, it had simply begun to pull apart. Amid the chaos, cities adapted. Local elites took on more responsibility. Towns fortified their walls. Some communities minted their own coins, organized their own defenses, and negotiated their own treaties. Rome was still the idea, the name on official documents, the language of the law. But in practice, the periphery learned to survive on its own. And yet, for all this fragmentation, Rome did not fall. The empire remained, like a wounded animal still breathing. The crisis revealed its weaknesses, but also its resilience. Infrastructure, though strained, endured. Cultural life continued. Temples were repaired. Theaters still staged comedies. In Alexandria, scholars still studied stars and copied scrolls. Life in the provinces, though unsettled, did not vanish. People adapted, as they always had, growing grain, paying taxes, raising families under shifting skies. In 268 CE, a moment of quiet resurgence began. Claudius II, known as Claudius Gothicus, defeated invading tribes and reasserted imperial control in the Balkans. His reign was short, but he was succeeded by a more enduring figure, Aurelian. Ruling from 270 to 275 CE, Aurelian proved both bold and efficient. He reconquered the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway empires, reunifying the Roman world. He strengthened the empire's borders and famously began construction on a new wall around Rome itself, the Aurelian Walls, still standing in part today, a testament to defensive realism. Aurelian called himself Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, and for a moment the world seemed mended. But the crisis had left deep marks. Confidence in central authority had eroded. The role of emperor now depended more than ever on military support. The Senate remained a ceremonial body. Emperors no longer ruled from Rome alone. The court was mobile, often stationed near troubled borders, reflecting the reality that control now required presence, not just prestige. This period also marked the slow transformation of Roman identity. More emperors came from the provinces. Latin and Greek remained dominant, but regional languages re-emerged in daily speech. The empire, once centered on the Mediterranean, began to lean eastward, toward Asia Minor, Syria, and beyond. The gods, too, shifted. Traditional Roman religion began to mingle more deeply with Eastern cults, mystery religions, and new spiritual movements that offered personal salvation and cosmic meaning. And in that quiet mingling, one small sect, once persecuted, scattered, and largely ignored, began to rise. Christianity, born on the empire's margins, carried by merchants and missionaries, was planting roots even in this time of chaos. It offered certainty where Roman politics faltered, hope where institutions trembled. The 3rd century would not see its triumph, not yet, but the seed had been planted in ground left softened by crisis. By the end of the century, the empire had survived, barely. It had bent, split, bled, and yet endured. But it had changed. The Rome of marble temples and civic calm had become a Rome of fortresses and shifting thrones. It was no longer a city ruling a world, but a world held loosely by 1,000 hands. The sun still rose over the Colosseum, grain ships still docked, the baths still filled with steam and conversation. But beneath it all, the question lingered, soft but constant. How long could such a thing endure? When Diocletian rose to power in 284 CE, the Roman Empire was weary. For nearly 50 years, it had been tested by civil war, economic collapse, and foreign threat. It had survived, but barely. A patchwork of cities, legions, and administrations held together more by habit than by harmony. Diocletian did not promise to restore the past. He did not echo Augustus or dream of the old republic. Instead, he offered something more radical and more pragmatic, a reimagining of empire itself, not as a singular Rome, but as a system that could stretch, split, and still endure. He began not with armies, but with administration. Recognizing the sheer size of the empire and the limits of one man's control, Diocletian created a new political structure, the tetrarchy, or rule of four. Rather than concentrate power in one emperor, he divided it among four rulers, two senior emperors, called Augusti, and two junior emperors, or Caesares. Each governed a different region of the empire, with their own courts, armies, and capitals. Diocletian took the east, ruling from Nicomedia. His co-Augustus, Maximian, governed the west from Mediolanum, modern Milan. The Caesars, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, served under them, destined to succeed when the time came. This division was not meant to fracture Rome, but to preserve it. By decentralizing power, Diocletian sought to respond more quickly to crises, manage borders more effectively, and avoid the chaos of succession that had plagued earlier decades. It was a structural solution to a political problem, elegant in theory, demanding in practice. Alongside political reform came a reordering of the empire's inner life. Diocletian reorganized the provinces, splitting larger regions into smaller units to prevent local governors from amassing too much power. He separated military and civil authority, creating distinct chains of command. And he built up a massive imperial bureaucracy, layers of officials who managed taxes, justice, and supplies. Empire became administration, and administration became survival. The economy, too, required repair. Inflation had spiraled for years, coinage debased, trade disrupted. In response, Diocletian introduced sweeping economic controls. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a detailed list of fixed prices for goods and services throughout the empire. It sought to curb inflation and stabilize markets, but proved difficult to enforce. Nonetheless, the gesture symbolized his approach: control through structure, survival through discipline. But perhaps most revealing was the way Diocletian reshaped the image of the emperor. Where Augustus had portrayed himself as the first citizen, modest, approachable, wrapped in the dignity of tradition, Diocletian embraced the language of divine monarchy. Emperors now dressed in jeweled robes, sat on elevated thrones, and were approached with elaborate ceremony. He was no longer simply a Roman magistrate. He was Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This shift, known as the Dominate, marked a clear departure from republican facades. The emperor was no longer among the people. He was above them. Temples were still maintained. The traditional gods were still honored. But the spiritual climate of the empire was changing. Christianity, once a scattered and persecuted sect, had grown quietly during the 3rd century. Its appeal lay in its promise of eternal life, its community networks, and its firm moral code. But to Diocletian, it was a threat, not because of theology, but because of disobedience. Christians refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor's genius, refused to bow before state gods. In an empire held together by ritual and hierarchy, this refusal was dangerous. And so, in 303 CE, Diocletian launched the Great Persecution, the most intense suppression of Christians in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy arrested. Some believers recanted under pressure, others became martyrs, their deaths later remembered in hagiographies, songs, and prayer. The persecution was widespread, but ultimately it failed to extinguish the growing faith. If anything, it strengthened it. In 305 CE, after 2 decades of rule, Diocletian did something no emperor before him had done voluntarily. He resigned. Ill and exhausted, he stepped down from power and retired to a palace in Split on the Dalmatian coast, a structure more fortress than villa, part retreat, part statement. He left behind the tetrarchy, confident that his system would endure. But power, once shared, rarely remains balanced. Within a few years, the tetrarchy collapsed into familiar patterns of rivalry and civil war. The Caesars and Augusti turned on each other. Alliances shifted, battles resumed. The world Diocletian had tried to hold with 4 hands now spun once again under the control of generals and ambition. Yet his legacy lingered. The administrative reforms, the reorganized provinces, the redefinition of imperial image, these remained. Diocletian had not saved the empire from change. He had accepted it. He reshaped it into something that might endure beyond the old forms. The Rome of togas and senatorial debate was long gone. In its place stood a Rome of purple cloaks, mobile courts, and regional power. In the silence of his retirement, surrounded by sea walls and stone colonnades, Diocletian reportedly tended to his gardens, refusing appeals to return to politics. He had done what few others had dared. Not rule as Rome once was, but reforge Rome as it now needed to be. And beyond his lifetime, in the aftermath of division and war, another figure would rise. One who would take the cross, not the eagle, as his standard. One who would inherit the world Diocletian had rebuilt and steer it into something altogether new. But before that moment, the empire, still divided, still vast, paused once more, balanced, barely, between old gods and new hope. When Constantine emerged from the turbulence of the early 4th century, Rome was no longer ruled from Rome. The tetrarchy had fractured. Emperors came and went, declared by troops, challenged by rivals, and tested by time. Constantine did not ascend with grandeur. He was proclaimed emperor by his father's army in 306 CE in the chilly province of Britannia after the death of Constantius Chlorus. It was not yet clear what kind of leader he would become, only that he carried the blood of a general and the ambition of a ruler who had seen the fragility of order up close. His rise was neither simple nor sudden. For 6 years, the empire remained divided, with multiple emperors competing for control. Alliances shifted, treaties frayed, and battles loomed on distant frontiers. Constantine ruled the western provinces, Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania, from the city of Trier, a place more frontier outpost than imperial capital. But from this quiet perch he governed with steadiness, slowly gaining the loyalty of soldiers, administrators, and the gods of fortune. Then, in 312 CE, came the moment that would change everything. Constantine marched on Rome to confront Maxentius, a rival claimant to imperial authority who had entrenched himself in the capital. The 2 armies met outside the city's walls, near the Milvian Bridge, a crossing over the slow, steady waters of the Tiber. What happened on the eve of battle has become legend, not for the clash of swords, but for a vision. According to later accounts, Constantine saw a sign in the sky, a cross of light accompanied by the words, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, you will conquer. That night, he reportedly instructed his soldiers to paint a strange symbol on their shields, the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ in Greek, intertwined like a key. It was not the eagle, it was not Jupiter. It was something new, quiet, uncertain, and profound. Constantine won the battle. Maxentius was defeated, his body pulled from the river's depths, and Constantine entered Rome not just as a conqueror, but as something more, a man touched by the divine, though not yet defined by it. He did not abolish the old gods. He did not declare Christianity the state religion, but the doors had opened. The cross had entered the palace. The following year, Constantine and his eastern counterpart Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, a declaration that granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christianity was now legal, its followers no longer hunted, its churches no longer destroyed, property was restored, persecution officially ended. It was not just an act of mercy. It was a calculated peace, a way to soothe a growing part of the population, to integrate a movement that had long resisted Rome's grasp. But Constantine's transformation did not stop with law. He began to favor Christians in court appointments. He built churches, first modest, then grand. The Lateran Basilica in Rome rose under his patronage, followed by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, marking the site believed to be Christ's tomb. His mother, Helena, embarked on pilgrimages, returning with relics and stories. The empire was beginning to take on a new shape, one built not just in stone, but in faith. By 324 CE, Constantine had defeated Licinius and become sole ruler of the empire. Yet he did not return to Rome. Instead, he founded a new capital, a city built on the ancient site of Byzantium, straddling the Bosporus Strait. He called it Nova Roma, but the world would remember it as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Its position was strategic, but its symbolism was clear. Power had shifted east. A new Rome had been born, not as a republic, not as a city of temples, but as a crossroads of empire and belief. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the Christian world to resolve theological disputes that threatened to divide the faith. The result was the Nicene Creed, a statement of doctrine that sought unity in belief, even as diversity in practice remained. Constantine himself was not yet baptized. He waited until his final days, but he had become a Christian emperor in all but ritual. The transformation was subtle, but total. The temples of old gods were not all closed, yet the pulse of Rome was changing. The emperor no longer bowed to Jupiter, but crossed himself in private. Christian bishops now sat beside senators. Martyrs were remembered not with whispers, but with feast days. A religion once carried by slaves and fishermen had entered the courts of power. And yet, Constantine ruled with the same strength and complexity as his predecessors. He reformed the military, stabilized the currency, and strengthened frontier defenses. His court maintained splendor. His laws maintained discipline. He did not dismantle the empire. He recast it into a new form where the spiritual and the political shared the same breath. When he died in 337 CE, Constantine was buried not as a god, but as a Christian, in the Church of the Holy Apostles, beneath a circle of empty sarcophagi meant for the 12 apostles, as if to place himself quietly among them. His legacy was vast. The first Christian emperor, the founder of Constantinople, the man who carried Rome across a threshold it could never uncross. The world he left behind was not yet medieval. The old structures still stood, the Senate still met, gladiators still fought, but the current had shifted. Rome no longer belonged solely to itself. It had opened to something wider, a vision not born in its hills, but in its margins. And in the stillness after his death, the empire paused again, waiting, changing, wondering what new shape it might take now that it had turned its face toward the cross. When Constantine died, the empire did not shatter. It split slowly, almost gracefully, like a worn page turned by time. The Roman world had grown too vast to be held by one hand alone. Roads stretched for thousands of miles, languages shifted from region to region, and threats emerged from every horizon. To preserve what remained, the empire quietly became two, east and west, two courts, two centers of administration, two reflections of the same worn crown. This division was not without precedent. Diocletian's tetrarchy had already prepared the way, proving that multiple emperors could govern in tandem, each responsible for a slice of the whole. But under Constantine, and more firmly under his successors, the East and West began to take on lives of their own, not as rivals, but as parallel realms, loosely bound by memory and mutual need. In the West, Rome remained the symbolic heart, but the administrative pulse had moved. Cities like Milan and Ravenna became preferred seats of imperial power, closer to the Rhine frontier, less exposed to internal unrest. The Western Empire inherited the older traditions of Latin speech, Roman law, and frontier defense. It remained Rome in name and in rhythm, but its voice grew thinner, stretched across declining revenues, increasingly dependent on federated troops and regional alliances. In the East, Constantinople rose like a second sun. Built atop the ancient city of Byzantium, it was a marvel of geography, guarding the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, surrounded on three sides by water, and shaped by Constantine into a new capital equal in grandeur to the old. Its forums and arches echoed those of Rome, its streets filled with merchants, scholars, soldiers, and priests. But its gaze was different. The East looked toward Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, regions rich in grain, gold, and ancient wisdom. Greek, not Latin, was the dominant tongue. The cities of the East had long histories of urban sophistication. In this half of the empire, the old and new entwined effortlessly. Politically, the two halves often cooperated. Emperors shared titles and dispatched envoys. Military campaigns were coordinated, borders defended, and administrative reforms implemented across regions. Yet, over time, their priorities began to diverge. The West faced constant pressure from migrating peoples, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Saxons, all testing the weakened frontiers, seeking land security and place. The East, more economically resilient, more urbanized, with stronger walls and deeper coffers, managed its threats differently, with gold as often as with steel. Religion too began to shift the balance. Christianity had now become the central faith of the empire, especially after Theodosius I, in 380 CE, declared Nicene Christianity the state religion, effectively outlawing public pagan rites. Pagan temples were closed, old festivals forgotten or rebranded. Christianity, once persecuted, now formed the spine of Roman identity. A transformation completed not by zeal, but by policy, by the slow institutional drift of power into new hands. The bishops of the major cities, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, rose in prominence. Church councils shaped doctrine. Heresies were named and condemned. The Christian world grew more organized and more divided. The East, home to intricate theological debates and competing patriarchates, leaned into doctrinal precision. The West, facing a more immediate struggle for survival, placed greater authority in the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, whose influence began to stretch beyond theology into matters of kings and kingdoms. Culturally, these changes deepened the gap. In the East, imperial ceremonies grew more elaborate. Icons, mosaics, and golden reliquaries adorned churches. Philosophy mingled with theology. Constantinople became a beacon of scholarship and diplomacy. In the West, many cities shrank. Literacy declined. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Yet a different kind of strength emerged, rooted in tradition, landed nobility, and local resilience. The division between East and West was not yet final. In 395 CE, after the death of Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule a fully unified Roman Empire, the separation became permanent. His sons inherited the empire, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. From that point onward, there would be two Roman emperors, each claiming legitimacy, each presiding over a world slowly forgetting its other half. Still, for the average citizen, little seemed to change. A farmer in Gaul, a merchant in Ephesus, or a soldier in Egypt continued their lives with familiar rhythms. Taxes were still collected, laws still enforced, the imperial image still stamped on coin. But slowly, a new reality settled in. Rome was now more than one place, more than one city, more than one destiny. In the West, signs of fragility appeared. Armies composed increasingly of federated allies, provinces managed by necessity rather than policy, cities vulnerable to sudden shifts in power. In the East, a quieter confidence grew, wealthier, more stable, better protected. This imbalance would shape the next centuries. One half would bend, then break. The other would endure, reshaped, renamed, but still calling itself Roman. And through it all, the name of Rome endured like a breath, spoken in different languages, echoed in different rituals, but still known. East and West, two halves of a world once whole, two roads winding forward, side by side, for now. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is often imagined as a single moment, a gate thrown open, a barbarian on a throne, a city in flames. But in truth, the end came not as a crash, but as a long, sighing wind. It blew across the Alps and through the forests of Germania. It stirred the grasslands of the steppe and whispered through empty villas and quieted forums. It was not a fall. It was a loosening, a slow unraveling of the systems that had once bound a continent. By the early 5th century, the Western Empire had grown brittle. The economy strained under the weight of endless wars and shrinking revenues. Armies, once composed of Roman citizens, now relied on federated tribes, allied peoples, often of non-Roman origin, who were granted land and status in exchange for military service. Loyalty was fragile, authority fragmented, and at the borders, pressure mounted. In 376 CE, a new force appeared. The Visigoths, fleeing from an even greater threat. The Huns, a nomadic people sweeping westward from the steppes of Central Asia. Seeking refuge, the Visigoths were granted permission to settle within Roman territory, south of the Danube. But mismanagement and mistreatment by Roman officials led to rebellion. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, Roman forces under Emperor Valens were disastrously defeated. Valens himself perished. The empire had suffered losses before, but never like this. The Roman army, the institution that had carried the empire for centuries, was humbled by those it once considered outsiders. In the decades that followed, the movements of peoples accelerated. This was not invasion in the modern sense, not armies descending on cities with coordinated plans, but a series of migrations, displacements, and responses to pressure. The Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the Rhine in 406 CE, flooding into Gaul. Some moved into Hispania, others kept moving. In 410 CE, an unthinkable event took place: the sack of Rome. The city, sacred and eternal in the Roman imagination, had not been captured in over 800 years. Yet now, Alaric, king of the Visigoths, led his forces through its gates. They did not destroy it utterly. The sack was brief, controlled, and not without reverence, but it shocked the world. Rome had always been the symbol of order. Now, its walls had been breached, not by traitors, but by former allies. And still, the empire did not fall. It limped forward, emperors crowned, dethroned, replaced. General Flavius Aetius, often called the last of the Romans, led Roman forces to a final moment of glory in 451 CE at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. Halting Attila, the Huns' advance into Gaul, but victories were fleeting. Power shifted not in battles, but in bargains. The empire's real strength now rested in the hands of generals and tribal kings who negotiated land and authority from within. In 455 CE, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals, who had established a kingdom in North Africa and sailed across the Mediterranean. their name would become a byword for destruction, though much of the violence was again symbolic, a stripping away of prestige, not wholesale ruin. By the 470s, the Western Empire had become a shadow. The army was largely non-Roman. Tax collection faltered. The Senate still met, but its influence was ceremonial. The emperor was often a child, a puppet, or a name without weight. Real power lay with figures like Ricimer, a general of barbarian descent who controlled the court from behind the curtain. Finally, in 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general serving in Italy. Romulus, still a teenager, was quietly removed and sent into retirement. There was no dramatic proclamation, no empire-wide collapse. Just a letter sent to the Eastern Emperor, declaring that no further Western emperors were needed. And with that, the Western Roman Empire ended, not with fire, but with formality. But the world it had shaped did not vanish. The Roman Church remained, its bishops now carrying the memory of Roman order. Roman law endured in local practice. Latin lingered on the tongues of peasants and priests, evolving into the languages we know today. Cities still bore Roman names. Roads still followed Roman paths. The idea of Rome, as a standard of law, architecture and identity, continued like the slow glow of embers. Many of the so-called barbarian leaders who now ruled former Roman lands sought not to destroy Rome's legacy, but to claim it. They styled themselves as Rex Romanorum, kings of the Romans. They used Roman titles, adopted Roman customs, minted coins in the old emperor's image. To rule Rome, even in its absence, was to hold a kind of quiet legitimacy. In Gaul, the Franks rose. In Hispania, the Visigoths settled. In Britannia, once Romanized, new kingdoms formed from Saxon, Anglo, and native roots. Across the old empire, a patchwork of new polities emerged. None fully Roman, none fully foreign. The Western Empire had faded, but its soul lingered in stone, in language, in law. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, still stood and would continue to call itself Roman for another 1,000 years. But in the West, Rome had passed into memory, not as a ruin, but as a root. So ended the western half of a world once whole, not with collapse, but with change, not in noise, but in the soft, steady shifting of identity. Rome, as a city, survived. Rome, as an idea, endured. And as night fell over the old forums and broken aqueducts, the roads of the Western Empire remained, quiet, worn, and still leading somewhere. While the Western Empire flickered and dimmed, the East remained, not untouched, but intact. From the golden shores of Constantinople, the Roman world looked eastward now, away from the crumbling walls of Rome and toward the bright cities of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. This was not a fallen empire's ghost, it was a living, breathing state. A new Rome built on older soil, shaped by new pressures, but still calling itself Roman. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium today, though its people never used that word, had always been wealthier, more urban, and better fortified than the West. Its cities were ancient, its trade routes rich, its culture a blend of Hellenistic, Roman, and Christian strands woven into a singular identity. Constantinople, its capital, gleamed on the edge of Europe and Asia, wrapped in mighty walls, ringed by harbors, and crowned with domes that caught the morning sun. Here, the Roman name continued not in imitation, but in evolution. The Senate still existed, but real power now lay with the emperor, an imperial figure both political and sacred. He ruled not from a forum, but from the great palace, his presence cloaked in ceremony, his audience choreographed like a sacred dance. The Roman emperor had once been a magistrate. In Byzantium, he was anointed, a steward of divine order on earth. Faith now shaped governance more deeply than ever. Christianity, once persecuted, was now the foundation of imperial ideology. The church and state were not separate spheres, but two arms of the same body. Bishops were advisors, patriarchs held influence. Religious councils shaped not only doctrine but imperial law. Heresies were not just spiritual errors, they were political threats. The empire defended orthodoxy as it once had defended borders. Under Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, Byzantium reached a high point of ambition. Determined to restore Roman glory, Justinian launched military campaigns to reclaim Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, a restoration of the empire, if only briefly. His general Belisarius recaptured Carthage and entered Ravenna, the fading jewel of the West. But these victories were costly. The conquest drained resources and left the empire stretched. Far more enduring was Justinian's work in law and architecture. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, a vast codification of Roman legal tradition that would echo through medieval Europe and beyond. And in the heart of Constantinople, he raised a structure that redefined sacred space, the Hagia Sophia. Its vast dome floated above marble floors, its windows spilling golden light, its mosaics shimmering with quiet reverence. Here was Rome, not in column and forum, but in dome and altar. Yet even Byzantium was not immune to turmoil. Wars flared at the borders against Persia, against Slavs, and later against the rising power of Islam. In the 7th century, the Eastern Empire lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of North Africa, lands that had once been its lifeblood. These were not just territorial losses, they were cultural and economic heartlands. The empire was wounded, but not undone. In response, it adapted. The administration shifted. Military districts or themes were established. Local regions governed by generals with both civil and military authority. This decentralized system allowed quicker response to threats and better integration of army and society. The economy, while disrupted, remained resilient. Trade continued with the East. Silk, spices, and ideas flowed through Constantinople's markets. Greek, not Latin, became the dominant language of court and culture. The empire still called itself Roman, but it now spoke Greek, worshipped in domed churches, and looked east for its enemies and allies. Byzantium's strength was not in numbers, but in adaptability. It survived through diplomacy, through gold, through walls. Its emperors learned to navigate a world of shifting powers, Arab caliphates, Bulgar kingdoms, and eventually Crusader armies and rising Slavic states. Through it all, Constantinople remained, the city of the world's desire, as it was once called, serene behind its walls, its church bells mingling with the sound of merchants and scribes. Culturally, Byzantium preserved and transmitted the ancient world. Its scholars copied manuscripts, debated philosophy, and wrote histories that bridged antiquity and the medieval. In monasteries and schools, knowledge was guarded and reinterpreted. The classics of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle were read alongside the scriptures and commentaries of Christian fathers. Art shifted from realism to iconography, a spiritual visual language of gold halos and solemn eyes, designed not to imitate nature, but to reflect the divine. Byzantine life moved with rituals both sacred and practical. Liturgies unfolded in incense and chant. Markets bustled with bread, wine, and fish. The sea walls held back storms. Ships moved through the Golden Horn. Families married, fasted, and celebrated saints' days. The empire was not immune to plague, rebellion, or doubt, but it endured. And so the Eastern Roman Empire carried the torch, not unchanged, but undimmed. While the West forgot how to build aqueducts, Byzantium maintained its libraries. While barbarian kings wore rough crowns, Byzantine emperors were robed in purple silk. For nearly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West, Constantinople kept the Roman name alive. It would face its end, eventually, in fire and steel, but not yet. For now, as twilight deepened in the West, A softer glow remained in the east. Rome had not fallen. It had shifted, translated, transfigured into something older and newer at once. A city of domes instead of columns, a faith in icons instead of eagles, but still unmistakably Rome. The Roman Empire, as a political entity in the West, had ended. Its legions disbanded, its emperors faded into history, its marble cracked and overgrown. But the idea of Rome, the name, the symbols, the laws, and the language, did not fall. It transformed, passed down not in golden banners or imperial decrees, but in parchment, architecture, ritual, and whispered memory. In the long centuries that followed, the world became medieval, and yet Rome remained, not as ruler, but as ancestor. In former Roman lands, new kingdoms rose. The Franks, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Lombards established realms across Europe, sometimes violently, sometimes diplomatically. But they did not see themselves as Rome's destroyers. They saw themselves as its heirs. Kings styled themselves Rex Romanorum, crowned in Latin ceremonies, wrapped in robes patterned after imperial finery. Coins bore familiar profiles. Laws were written in Latin, even as local tongues evolved around them. Roman law lingered in the courts. Roman roads still led to market squares. The calendar still marked months by Roman names. At the heart of this inheritance stood the Church. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became not only a religious leader, but a symbol of continuity. While political structures crumbled, the Church endured. Monasteries copied texts, preserved learning, and taught a new generation of leaders. Christian feast days layered themselves onto old Roman festivals. Saints replaced household gods, but the sense of sacred time remained. In the quiet cells of scriptoria, monks transcribed Cicero, Virgil, and Livy, preserving the voice of Rome for future centuries. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued to call itself Roman, but in the West, a different kind of Rome began to re-emerge, not as a city or empire, but as a dream. In 800 CE, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in a solemn Christmas ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica. The coronation was not just a political act, it was a resurrection, a claim that the Roman Empire, long silent in the West, had returned, reimagined in Christian terms, governed not from marble palaces, but from armored courts and wooden halls. This new entity, later known as the Holy Roman Empire, would stretch through the medieval world in various forms, often more symbolic than centralized. Its emperors ruled over Germanic lands, often in uneasy alliance with the papacy. The title Roman Emperor no longer meant commanding legions or governing provinces. It meant defending the faith, upholding tradition, and claiming descent from an ancient authority that still held weight in the minds of men. Art and architecture carried the legacy forward. Romanesque churches echoed the basilicas of old, with thick columns and rounded arches. Vaulted ceilings and orderly layouts recalled the balance and geometry of Roman design. Later, as the Gothic style rose, the spirit of Rome remained beneath the stone. In the precision, the symmetry, the desire to reach upward while remaining grounded in classical logic. Roman law, too, found new life. In the 12th century, scholars in Bologna and other European cities rediscovered Justinian's Code, the great legal compilation of the Eastern Empire. It became the foundation of civil law in much of Europe, influencing courts, kings, and codifiers for generations. The idea that law could be written, reasoned, and universal, a Roman concept, shaped modern jurisprudence. Language told its own story. Latin, once the voice of empire, became the tongue of scholars, poets, priests, and kings. It no longer lived in markets, but in books and prayers. From it emerged the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, each carrying echoes of old Rome in their rhythms and words. Even English, shaped by conquest and contact, absorbed Latin deeply through religion and learning. And in education, Rome remained a standard. The trivium and quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts of medieval curriculum, drew on Roman and Greek models. Young scholars learned grammar, rhetoric, and logic, tools sharpened first in Roman forums. They read Roman histories not only to learn events, but to understand order, governance, and virtue. Yet Rome was not only remembered, it was imagined in poems, in visions, in the architecture of cathedrals and the pageantry of courts. The medieval mind saw Rome not as a closed chapter, but as a high note to be emulated, a mirror to hold up to a world constantly seeking structure. The city itself became a place of pilgrimage. Crusaders, kings, and scholars all passed through its ruins, feeling the weight of broken columns, the echo of greatness in silence. Even as new powers rose, Islamic caliphates, Slavic kingdoms, Carolingian heirs, and merchant republics, Rome remained in the background, like a low chord beneath the melody of history. Not always seen, but always heard. And so the afterlife of Rome was not a shadow, it was a seed. Rooted deeply in law, language, and belief, it grew in many forms, not identical to the old tree, but unmistakably descended. Rome was no longer a city ruling the world. It had become a world within the city, carried forward in parchment and stone, in prayer and custom, in imagination and inheritance. It is often said that Rome fell, but perhaps it is truer to say that Rome changed rooms, leaving behind its throne, its legions, its senators, and entering the houses of worship, the halls of learning, and the dreams of generations still to come. When people think of ancient Rome, they often picture marble temples, emperors in togas, or legions marching across dusty plains. But perhaps Rome's most enduring legacy lies beneath those images, in the things it built to last, in the ground beneath feet, in the bridges that spanned rivers, in the stone-lined channels that carried clean water across valleys and mountains. These were not monuments to gods or rulers. They were gifts to time. And long after the empire faded, these structures remained, steady, silent, and still in use. The Roman road system, vast and astonishingly precise, was perhaps the greatest thread tying the empire together. Over 250,000 miles of roads were constructed, with 50,000 miles paved, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the eastern cities of Syria, from the Scottish Highlands to the deserts of North Africa. These roads were built with methodical care, a foundation of crushed stone, layers of gravel, and a paved surface, often crowned for drainage. Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, is among the most famous. A path still walkable today, its ancient stones worn smooth by centuries of use. But these were not only roads for soldiers. They were arteries of communication, trade, and movement. Couriers traveled at remarkable speed, carrying messages from emperor to governor. Merchants moved goods, amphorae of olive oil, sacks of grain, bolts of cloth. Pilgrims journeyed to temples, students to academies, and later, bishops to councils. Even as the empire fractured, the roads endured, serving kingdoms that had never built them, but depended on their permanence. In tandem with the roads came another quiet marvel, the aqueducts. These graceful structures, with their rhythmic arches and gentle gradients, carried clean water from distant springs into the heart of cities. Rome itself had 11 major aqueducts at its peak, bringing in millions of gallons daily. The Aqua Claudia, begun under Caligula and completed under Claudius, stretched over 40 miles. The Pont de Gare in modern-day France still stands, not as a ruin, but as a functioning bridge of time. The genius of Roman water engineering lay not in force, but in subtlety. Aqueducts flowed by gravity, following natural contours with barely perceptible slopes. Tunnels were carved through hills, siphons built to cross valleys. water was stored in cisterns, distributed to public fountains, baths, private homes, and even ornamental gardens. It wasn't just access, it was dignity. To live in a Roman city was to live with water, cool, flowing, available. Beneath the cities, sewer systems carried waste away. The Cloaca Maxima in Rome, originally an open drainage channel in the 6th century BCE, became a complex network of tunnels flushing sewage into the Tiber. This hidden infrastructure helped prevent disease and flooding. And even in the empire's fading days, these systems kept working. They outlasted the emperors who commissioned them. Public baths, too, were feats of engineering. Heated by hypocausts, systems of raised floors and hollow walls that channeled warm air. These buildings were more than places to wash. They were centers of social life. The largest, like the baths of Caracalla, could accommodate thousands, with separate rooms for hot, warm, and cold immersion. They included gardens, libraries, and exercise spaces. To bathe in Rome was to enter a shared rhythm, a ritual of health, status, and civic belonging. In the provinces, these technologies spread like quiet promises. Towns in Gaul, Britannia, and North Africa built their own baths, roads, and aqueducts, scaled to local needs, but rooted in Roman design. Some of these systems, remarkably, were maintained for centuries after Rome's political authority vanished. In the early Middle Ages, monastic communities and city councils continued to repair old aqueducts. In some places, water still flowed through Roman pipes. Roads were patched and used by pilgrims, traders, and armies alike. Roman bridges, too, withstood the ages. The Alcantara Bridge in Spain, built in the 2nd century CE, still spans the Tagus River. Its inscription reads, "I have built a bridge which will last forever." And for the most part, it has. The durability of these structures was not only material, though Roman concrete, made with volcanic ash and lime, was unusually strong, but philosophical. Romans built with the future in mind, not only for glory, but for function. Not merely for themselves, but for the community, for the rhythm of daily life. Roads were milestones of connection. Aqueducts were lines of trust. Sewers were silent caretakers. The city itself was a system, a machine made of stone. And even after the world that built them changed, these systems remained. Medieval pilgrims walked Roman roads to sacred shrines. Early Islamic engineers studied Roman aqueducts to design their own. Renaissance architects measured Roman arches, columns, and domes to rediscover proportion and balance. The infrastructure became not only useful, but instructional, a language of permanence written in earth and water. Today, Roman ruins draw the eye. Tourists marvel at aqueducts standing alone in fields, at arches rising in the middle of modern streets. But often, these remnants are not dead. They are still serving. A road still used. A bridge still crossed. A drainage channel still working beneath a modern city. And so, long after the last emperor of the West fell, long after the Senate ceased to meet, long after the language changed and the faith shifted, the works of Roman hands endured, quietly, without ceremony. Because Rome was not just an empire of conquest, it was an empire of infrastructure. And infrastructure, done well, does not need to announce itself. It simply works.